hearing for Thursday, May 14th, 2015. I'd like to remind members of the audience that the Commission does not tolerate any disruption or outbursts of any kind. Please silence any mobile devices that may sound off during these proceedings. And when speaking before the Commission, if you care to, do state your name for the record. I'd like to take roll at this time. Commission Chair Wu.
Here.
Commissioner Antonini.
Present.
Commissioner Johnson.
Here.
Commissioner Moore.
Here.
And Commissioner Richards.
Here.
We do expect Commissioners Fong and Hillis to arrive shortly. Commissioners, first on your agenda is consideration of items proposed for continuance. Item 1 for case number 2013.1762D at 372 Sussex Street, staff-initiated request for discretionary review is proposed for continuance to May 28, 2015. Items 2A and B for case numbers 2013.1521D, D, and V at 22 Ord Court, discretionary review and variance, as well as items 3A and B for case numbers 2013.1522D, D, and V at 24 Ord Court, discretionary review and variances. Commissioners, these were proposed for continuance to June 18th. We received a request a couple days ago to push that out one more week to June 25th. So the new proposed date for continuance is June 25th. I have no other items proposed for continuance, and I have no speaker cards.
Is there any public comment on items proposed for continuance? Seeing none, public comment is closed. Commissioner Moore.
Move items 1 through 3 to the dates noted and to the additional dates suggested by Commission Secretary.
Second.
Thank you, Commissioners. On that motion to continue matters as proposed, Commissioner Antonini?
Aye.
Commissioner Hillis? Aye. Commissioner Johnson?
Aye.
Commissioner Moore? Aye. Commissioner Richards?
Aye.
Commissioner Wu?
Aye.
And Commission President Fong? Aye. So moved, Commissioners. That motion passes unanimously 7-0. Zoning Administrator, what say you?
I will also continue the two variance cases for 22 Ord Court to June 25th, 2015.
Thank you, Zoning Administrator. Commissioners, it'll place you under Commission Matters. Item 4, consideration of adoption draft minutes for April 30th, 2015.
Is there any public comment on draft minutes? Seeing none, public comment is closed. Do we have a motion? Commissioner Antonini.
Move to approve.
Second.
On that motion to adopt the minutes for April 30th, 2015, Commissioner Antonini.
Aye.
Commissioner Hillis. Aye. Commissioner Johnson.
Aye.
Commissioner Moore.
Aye.
Commissioner Richards.
Aye.
Commissioner Wu.
Aye.
And Commission President Fong. Aye. So moved, Commissioners. That motion passes unanimously 7-0 and places you on item 5, Commission comments and questions.
Commissioner Moore.
I'd like to report that the Subcommittee on Rules met for the 5th time today, its last time, and the findings will be forwarded in written form to the full Commission. It was a very productive and good time, and we had good participation and good discussions. The other point I'd like to make is I'd like to add to our action list an item that I am very interested in and have become increasingly concerned. As we see many large projects changing owners, we would like to have a discussion or hear from the department what are the obligations that are retained when a project just takes its entitlements but needs to also consider or potentially consider obligations about particular list concerns this Commission is fighting for. That is attitudes towards the public realm, attitudes about light wells and specific building elements. I'd like to just throw out those few to have the director consider giving us a report on that particular item.
Thank you. Commissioner Antonini.
Yeah, just a couple of questions and comments on the whole drought situation. I'm kind of curious what's really going on here, because if you look in the paper every day, it tells all the different districts and what their normal for the date is as far as their reservoirs and where they are today. Well, San Francisco, predominant reservoir is Hetch Hetchy, and normally it's at 60. Today it's at 76. So it means we're considerably above what we normally would be for the year. So there are places, particularly East Bay Mud and others, that are in dire conditions. Actually, Marin is ahead of normal, too. Most of their water is from lakes out there. But it just, you know, I know that we supply another 1.5 or 1.6 million customers that are not the city of San Francisco, but even then we're apparently at 76%. So I'm just curious what there seems to be this global policy that's statewide, but each district only gets the water that they have themselves unless, you know, there is some kind of trading of water. So I think it's a little curious why we have parks and medians that have been part of San Francisco for over 100 years and we're letting them dry up. Careful management, you could take care of those things with small amounts of water and not lose, because once they're gone, it's going to cost a lot to replace them again. So I would hope we can figure out how to do this in a reasonable way without overreacting and trying to look like we're conserving even though we don't have to. I hate to say that, but it certainly looks like it from the figures I'm seeing here.
Commissioner Johnson.
Thank you very much. We definitely need to conserve, and on a future date I'll be asking about gray water infrastructure, but that's not my comment today. Last week when we were talking about a project that was happening in the Dog Patch, 901 Tennessee, I was again concerned about how we are encouraging neighborhood development and our streetscape, and especially our storefront active uses. I won't even say retail, because you can have active uses that aren't necessarily a retail business. I come from, I came to the Planning Commission with a history in redevelopment and the successor to redevelopment, which were had much more universal and global planning about how to create new neighborhoods from scratch. And so this was never a question, because the master plan for the redevelopment area determined what the streetscapes would be, where the parks would be, where would the storefronts be, how much square footage for commercial versus residential. So it's a major change to come over to the Planning Commission, where now we're looking project by project. And I'm highly concerned that the incentives are not aligning to create livable neighborhoods, particularly in our eastern neighborhoods where we have a lot of development coming up. These neighborhoods are changing. They're no longer sort of out of the way backwaters where it's sort of all residential and the services are more in city centers where people are maybe biking or transit or walking or even driving to get to them. There needs to be neighborhood serving retail. There need to be active uses on the streetscape in these neighborhoods. And I feel like the incentives are not aligning for developers to do that on a project by project basis. So I would love to hear from the department. Once again, we're looking at the action list, but about how we can incentivize that sort of development. I'm starting to believe that it's not enough to just encourage developers to do that in their own spaces, because if there's not enough of a core of developers who are planning their spaces all at the same time, like we actually have seen a couple projects that have sort of joined forces, but for the most part, that's not the case. We're never going to see it, and we're going to look up the eastern neighborhoods, particularly, focusing on the Dog Patch, is going to be built out, and all of those buildings are going to have ground floor residential, ground floor units, because no one wanted to build commercial space on the ground floor. So, high horse, I'm getting on it today, and I just want to say that I would love to hear from the department about ways that we can incentivize that development in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Richards.
Interestingly enough, today before I came to the commission, I received my first political mailer on a land use ballot initiative. I think it's going to be a long election season. This is for, I guess, the Giants project. It's called Mission Rock.
Yep.
This is only May 17th, May 14th, May 17th, 14th, sorry. I understand I was approached yesterday by folks at the farmers market for a ballot initiative for the Flower Mart, so that makes two. I sat in a meeting last night with Commissioner Wu in the Mission, hearing a lot of the issues that a lot of the folks in that neighborhood are faced with. So I imagine that if the Board of Supervisors doesn't pass the Mission Housing Pause, also known as moratorium, we're probably looking at three. And then I'm also imagining there'll be a fourth one for short-term rentals. So it looks like it's going to be an election season chock full of land use ballot planning. On the short-term rentals piece, I wanted to make a couple of comments. First, the budget analyst this morning came out with a report on the impact of short-term rentals on the housing stock for the city, and it's, I think, somewhere between what the one side is saying on the upper end. They were talking about 5,000 units, and folks on the lower end saying it's just a couple of hundred. Actually, he came out with a range between 925 and 1,960 units being taken off the market, and these are units, not bedrooms in homes. These are units. In some of the neighborhoods, that represents 30% of the actual vacant rental unit stock. Some of the hardest neighborhoods that are hit have the highest numbers of these units taken off the market, the Mission, the Castro being two of them. Another thing I read last night while I was going to bed, and it kind of made me not be able to sleep, I read an article, I think it was in the Sacramento Bee. Senator Mike McGuire from Healdsburg has sponsored Senate Bill 593 to regulate short-term rentals statewide. One of the things that came up in the discussion, I guess, with at the committee when they were hearing it, and we didn't know about it, and we were sitting here discussing the short-term rental bill, was around enforcement. And in fact, there are already two municipalities that require short-term rental registration numbers to be provided, Seal Beach and Sausalito. Yet nobody from either side mentioned that while we were talking about it. Certainly Mr. Owen didn't as well. And we thought that it was going to be something brand new and it was going to be hard to do, but at least Airbnb and the other hosting platforms are already doing it. And that really disappoints me that we didn't have that piece of information when we were debating that item number 6 that day. Thank you.
Commissioners, if there's nothing further, we can move on to department matters. Item 6, Director's announcements.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Commissioners. A couple of items today. Today is Bike to Work Day. There was a lot of people biking today, and I just wanted to thank all the planning staff who really got out there and made it a big event and encouraged the entire department. We must have had a very high percentage rate of a participation. I don't know how many, but I think it was well in excess of 50% of the department who probably biked to work today, so I'm very proud of that. And I also want to just thank my colleagues at MTA and DPW and Rec Park who really have gone into this in a big way. The city now has well over 400 miles of bike lanes in the city and bike facilities, and we are adding a rate of about 40 to 50 miles a year. So it's a great testament to how we can make this work. Secondly, per Commissioner Moore's point, the very issue of projects that change hands after entitlement has become an interesting issue that I've had many inquiries about from commissioners and from supervisors on. And one of the issues that keeps coming up is that new owners want to change the design. And we struggle. And so staff is actually having to repeat all of our work with developers on the same project over and over again and negotiate some of this work. So I think it would be helpful for us to have a hearing and specifically to talk about the conditions of approval and what they do and don't say with respect to the design and the specificity of the design of the project. So I would like to suggest that we do have a hearing in the future about that. Thirdly, the Commissioner Richards' mention of the ballot measures reminds me to remind all of us about restrictions on when items are on the ballot and how we can or cannot be involved. I will resurrect the memo from the city attorney's office to send to commissioners and to staff. It's obviously going to be an important election season that actually impacts the work of the department. So it's important for us all to remind ourselves what we can and cannot do with that with respect to ballot measures. So I'll pull that out as well. That concludes my report.
Commissioners, if there are no questions, we can move on to item 7, review of past events at the Board of Supervisors, Board of Appeals. There was no Historic Preservation Commission meeting yesterday.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Aaron Starr, Planning Department staff. At this week's Land Use Committee hearing, the required CU for certain uses in Castro, 24th Street, Noe, and Upper Market NCDs, sponsored by Supervisor Weiner, was heard. This ordinance requires conditional use authorization for business or professional services, medical services, and limited financial service uses located on the first story within the Castro, 24th Street, Noe Valley, and Upper Market Street NCDs, and parcels located along or zoned NCT3 along Market Street west of Octavia. The Planning Commission heard the proposed ordinance on April 23, 2015, and recommended approval with modifications. These include to further study principally permitting business or professional service uses on the third story and above in the subject NCDs. This recommendation was not included in the final ordinance. At the Land Use Committee, Supervisor Wiener introduced the ordinance, its goals, the community outreach conducted, and the community support received to date. Public comment was supportive of the ordinance and expressed a desire to spread these controls across the city. Supervisor Wiener made the motion to move the ordinance with a favorable recommendation to the full board, and the motion passed unanimously. Also at the Land Use Committee was the redesignation of 149 9th Street. This was sponsored by Planning. This ordinance amends the Planning Code to change the designation of 149 to 155 9th Street, also known as the Western Manufacturing Company building, from a Category 5, which is an unrated building, to a Category 3, which is a contributory building under Article 11 of the Planning Code. On January 21st of this year, the Historic Preservation Commission unanimously voted to recommend approval to the Board of Supervisors. At the Land Use hearing, Supervisor Kim moved to amend the ordinance to include language that would allow the property to be included in this year's round of Mills Act contracts. That amendment was accepted by the committee, and the item was then unanimously recommended as amended to the full board. Finally, at the Land Use Committee, we had a hearing on the disposition of 30 Van Ness Avenue. This was sponsored by Supervisors Campos, Kim, and Marr. This was a hearing to review the disposition of 30 Van Ness Avenue. Supervisors Campos and Kim and Marr sponsored the ordinance, and Supervisor Campos was sitting with the committee during the hearing. The issue at hand was whether 30 Van Ness, which is owned by the city and currently used for city offices, should be considered surplus property and sold to affordable housing developer. City law requires surplus property to be offered to affordable housing developers first. 30 Van Ness is not deemed surplus because the building is fully occupied by city agencies, so the city requirement that it be sold for affordable housing does not apply. The current plan for the property is to sell it and use the proceeds to build new city offices at the Goodwill site located at South Van Ness and Mission, which will also be the future home of the Planning Department. During the hearing, Director Ram, John Lopdike, the Director of the Real Estate Division, and Elson Lee, the Director of the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development, gave testimony and answered questions raised by the committee. As this was a hearing and not an action item, the committee voted to file the item at the end. This week at the full Board of Supervisors, the noise regulations relating to residential uses near places of entertainment, sponsored by Supervisor Breed, passed its second and final read. The landmark designation for the R.L. Goldberg building also passed its second read, and Supervisor Tang's massage establishment ordinance passed its first read. We had 4 introductions this week. The first was a urgency ordinance making the Board of Supervisors sit as a committee of the whole to hear Supervisor Campos's housing moratorium. The committee would be on June 2nd of this year. The next one was a planning code amendment for inclusionary housing requirements in the eastern neighborhoods. This was sponsored by Supervisor Kim. This ordinance amends the planning code to eliminate the rental incentive from the eastern neighborhoods urban mixed-use districts that permits project sponsors to lower their inclusionary affordable housing requirement and applicable eastern neighborhoods public benefit fee by agreeing to maintain the units as rental units for 30 years. Another introduction was an amendment to the planning code for residential mergers, permeable surfaces, and landscaping requirements, sponsored by Supervisor Avalos. This ordinance amends the planning code to require conditional use authorization for all residential mergers and to require compliance with landscaping and permeable surface requirements for building additions and residential mergers. And finally, Supervisor Campos's housing moratorium ordinance was reintroduced as well. That concludes my comments. Thank you.
Commissioner Antonini.
Thanks for your report. Just a question on the proposed legislation from Supervisor Kim regarding policies that were applicable in the eastern neighborhoods. Wouldn't that legislation deal with something that was part of the eastern neighborhoods legislation? The plans?
It would remove the provision that's in the code for these neighborhoods.
Yeah, because I seem to remember that as being established as part of eastern neighborhoods. So I'm wondering what kind of method is necessary to revise something that was part of the neighborhood plan. It would seem like should be a fairly high bar to pass.
I believe that, community outreach probably should be undertaken. I'm not sure if Supervisor Kim has done that, but I'm sure she's heard from her community about it. But we can look into that to see if there is anything special that needs to be done.
I'm just not so much the outreach, I'm just talking legislatively about the level that the supervisors would have to have, or if they have to take it back to the Planning Commission to change parts of what was approved in Eastern Neighborhood.
Well, they do have to take the ordinance to you, so you would be considering it.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Corey Teague, Assistant Zoning Administrator, sitting in for Scott Sanchez, Zoning Administrator. I was not at the Board of Appeals hearing last night, but he was, and he did provide me with a report. There were 3 items heard by the Board of Appeals last night that would be of interest to this Commission. The first was 1055 Ashbury Street. This item was previously heard by the Planning Commission as a joint DR and variance case. At a previous hearing on the appeal, the Board of Appeals continued the item with a request to the sponsor to reduce the massing at the rear. The sponsor submitted a revision with a 3-foot setback at the rear of the top level, and the board voted to unanimously accept that revision. Second item was 300 Wawona Street. That item was previously heard at the Planning Commission as a DR. At that hearing, the Commission voted unanimously to not take DR and approve the project. After the Commission hearing, a CEQA appeal was filed but withdrawn prior to the hearing. And last night, the board heard an appeal on the building permit. The appellant argued that the project did not comply with the rear yard requirement, but staff confirmed that the project was code-compliant, and the board unanimously upheld that permit. And lastly, 3378 Sacramento Street. It was a revocation request, and the item was an appeal of a revocation request for a permit that was improperly issued for the subject property. The permit sought to establish a medical use in the Sacramento Neighborhood Commercial District. Such uses are only permitted if the last legal use was a business and professional service use, which itself requires a conditional use authorization. In this case, the last known use of the property was a retail use as an art gallery that had been in place for approximately 10 years. However, the permit stated that the existing use was a business and professional service use. So the permit holder could not demonstrate that the permit was properly issued, so the board unanimously upheld the revocation request. And that was all they heard that was of interest to this commission.
Commissioner Richards.
It's interesting. This is, I think, the 3rd week in a row. Something that we've decided on was altered at the Board of Appeals. I'm kind of, they've cut a floor off 901 Carolina. They put 1066 Ashbury. They did 3-foot setback. Things that we struggled with. Yet the Board of Appeals seems to be, changing what our decisions are, and it's interesting. I'm kind of probably meeting with a couple of the members of the Board of Appeals just to chat with them about what their thought process is, because I'd rather get it right here than have them have to change stuff that we do. Thanks.
Commissioners, if there's nothing further, we can move on to general public comment not to exceed a period of 15 minutes. At this time, members of the public may address the commissioners on items of interest to the public that are within the subject matter jurisdiction of the commission, except agenda items. With respect to agenda items, your opportunity to address the commission will be afforded when the item is reached in the meeting. Each member of the public may address the commission for up to 3 minutes. I have no speaker cards.
Is there any general public comments?
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Rose Hilson, member of Jordan Park Improvement Association, also member of the Coalition for San Francisco Neighborhoods Land Use Committee. I was present at the previous meeting to this one, which was the Rules Committee meeting for the Planning Commission, and we were going over some of the issues that came up. With the hearing submittal guidelines. And I drafted a corrected memo, and I gave 10 copies to Secretary Ione, and so the rest of the commissioners should get that eventually, and I will also email it to you. It's about not only the snail mail and electronic mail delays in getting basically the notices to the public and public access to get things like the case packets. The case reports are different than the submittal packets that are that have a deadline of after the case report is already submitted. So that means the public wouldn't get the case report in the packets. And so that's going to be an issue with the public trying to get the information in advance, just like everyone else probably should get. And I would also like to add that it's important to read the staff case report because their opinions matter. So that's all. Thanks.
Commissioners, good afternoon. My name is Justin Allen Ryan. I'm here to talk about illegal office conversions in the Mission. last week, I was involved in a conversation where I offered to help design indoor bike parking at the new office that the company I was working for was moving into. I said we should invite the Bike Coalition. They may have a template that they can give our contractor. The person I was talking to clearly felt that the Bike Coalition was some kind of city agency, and I kind of got this response like, we might not have any permits, so we're not going to invite people. Exactly my reaction. I believe my reaction was, oh. This is at 351 Alabama, which they're calling 350 Florida. They're converting a loading dock into an entrance. It's first floor office space. I walked the area with Building Commissioner Deborah Walker, who lives in the area as well. She had already observed construction at this site and sent notes on this, and I want to say 8 or 9 other almost identical type of developments. A building inspector went out on Monday, found no construction underway, although on Friday I received a staff email saying we were having meetings in there when there was non-dangerous construction happening or whatever, right, when they were cleaning. And they said we can't have meetings, in which I also don't. Maybe that was legal. I mean, we can't have meetings in there anymore for the next couple of weeks. They're going to be putting up drywall, and a picture of a stack of drywall and like a machine of some kind, I don't know, forklift. It's only kind of in my memory because unfortunately that's in my company email, which is no longer active, and the picture did not download before. It's like I viewed it on my company computer. So I brought this up at BOS meeting on Tuesday. I talked to Supervisor Campos' office, but I just wanted to kind of ring as many bells as I can. Personally, I've been a housing activist and other kind of activist in the area for a pretty good while, and it is a real struggle for them. I also have technical skills, which are my most employable thing right now. So it's difficult for me to find work where I don't run into some kind of a moral conflict, but something like this is so egregious that before I get on with trying to find my next opportunity, I want to make sure and alert all the right folks, and if there's anyone else that I should talk to continue trying to sort of carry the flag on this, I would welcome feedback from any of you, but if not, thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Sue Hester, it's hard to follow a person like that. With regard to Commissioner Johnson's request, I think it would be really good to communicate to the CAC, which is meeting, Eastern Neighborhood CAC, which is meeting on Monday night at the Planning Department office. I would ask the Planning Department staff to assist in communicating her request to that meeting, because the Eastern Neighborhood CAC has to struggle with exactly the same issues that you brought up, and they're extremely valuable. Second thing is, what path should the public take to get consideration done of its suggestions that issues need to be addressed on the rules? Ms. Hilson brought up a part of the issue, which is the public is basically frozen out, especially in the eastern neighborhoods, from communicating with the public, but with the commission, because if you get a staff report right before the hearing, and one day in advance isn't a solution, you have no EIR, no neg deck, no plans. You have a staff report that comes out a couple days in advance. It's a desperate situation. You have written off all the eastern neighborhoods, which is where the action is, from having constructive input. If you're not going to do it through the Rules Committee, tell us how we will do it. What do we have to do to get your attention to consider at a public hearing the requests for serious 2-week staff reports and serious CEQA reports that are not 6 days or 7 days in advance of the hearing? Secondarily, we have had a struggle to really have information on emails and electronic files. We don't have paper files in the planning department anymore. They're electronic. And there is no pathway for information to be shared with the public on this. If you're not going to set a hearing on it, how do we do it? I'm asking for some basic information. I've been raising this in writing to all 7 planning commissioners. I would think you would really struggle with these issues. How to enable informed public comment, really informed public comment, and how to tell the public they have to get into the stream of the emails because they show a lot of what's happening in the department. Secondarily, I think you should have hills that have hills on them. Just hills. We have a terrain issue in San Francisco.
Is there any additional public comment? Okay, not seeing any public comments closed. Commissioner Wu.
I wanted to thank that member of the public who came out to speak. I think that it really takes a lot to come out to enforce on things like that. It reminded me, and I know it's not on the agenda today, that Kate Sophus from SF MAID has really been raising this issue a lot, illegal conversion of PDR space into office. And so want to ask if there's an appropriate forum for either a meeting with commissioners and Kate and maybe OEWD, because I know they've been playing a key role in PDR, or if it's a hearing here and that's more transparent. I'm open to what the forum is, but I think it's really been an issue.
Commissioner Moore.
Very similar thoughts. I would like to also ask that we involve the 2 supervisors who have been very strong in PDR protection, Supervisor Campos and Reed. No, Cohen, I'm sorry, Cohen. I wanted to inform the President that the issue raised by the 2 public comments is part of what is being forwarded for further review to the full body. It is a very complicated issue and far larger than what we felt could really address in the subcommittee. So I think Secretary Ionen will give you a full update of what we discussed and what we are recommending for the full body to review further.
Thank you. Commissioner Richards.
I like the idea of a hearing where it's completely transparent, and I think we should get all the issues out on the table and hear them. Thank you.
Commissioners, if there's nothing further, we can move on to your regular calendar. Item 8, the Housing Policy Informational Presentation.
Sorry,
Commissioner Johnson, sorry.
Sorry about that. Commissioner Secretary Onen, before we start the presentation, are there any materials that we should have gotten? There was nothing linked in the, was that linked in the agenda? Okay,
No.
I didn't think so. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Gil Kelly, Director of Citywide Planning. I'm here this afternoon, along with a couple of other speakers, as a follow-up to the 5-year work plan presentation we gave you back in January. You'll recall that we set out a fairly ambitious work plan for ourselves over the next 5 years to really get out in front of a lot of the big issues facing San Francisco. And perhaps the most critical of those had to do with remaining an inclusive and equitable city. And at the center of that discussion, of course, is a matter of housing, housing policy, housing affordability. So you asked that we come back and sort of talk about these topically so that we divide up that work plan and come back and actually have a discussion with you about these. So today we want to do sort of part 1 of the housing discussion. That is to say, to set a context and to provoke some general questions, and we hope that provokes actually a discussion amongst you. We certainly will be here to answer questions, and of course you may want to take public comment as well, but we're hoping actually that this engenders a bit of discussion on your part so that we can use that to form part two. So if today is really setting context and asking some of the larger questions, we'd like to return with a closer-in discussion of kind of the planning toolkit, including those levers and controls that are most at your disposal in a subsequent session in another month or two. So that being said, I just wanted to sort of preview one of the punchlines here today, which is that you're quite accustomed to talking about, because of what the projects that come in front of you week after week, you're very accustomed to talking about requirements for production of new housing, for new development, and conditions you may want to place on that, as well as the regulatory requirements that apply across the board. That's an important component of the housing arena, but if you think that we produce maybe 1 to 2% of the housing stock total each year, that's important. But two other things are also important. One is that the base of existing housing stock is a critical component of housing here. And we want to shine a light a little bit on that today because of the accelerating erosion, really, of the affordability of the current housing stock. Secondly, as you'll see, I think, from some of the subsequent presentations here today, that this can't be viewed only as a San Francisco problem. This is really a regional issue. And we can do a lot within our 47 square miles, but we will not be able to build our way out, nor even preserve our way out of the total affordable housing need that we have. And so it does provoke some thinking about what else do we do in terms of regional policy making, in terms of regional coordination around the housing issue. So with that introduction, let me just move through the first few slides. I'm going to be joined in a moment by Kirsten Dischinger, who you know very well as our Chief Housing Policy Coordinator in the Planning Bureau, and by Ted Egan, who's the City Chief Economist, is here today to again help set some of that context. There are also others here today who can help answer questions you may have, including Sophie Hayward from the Mayor's Office of Housing, Robert Collins from the Rent Board, and Audrey Desmuke from the Planning Department, who has provided a lot of the data that's behind this today and, of course, appeared in the housing inventory and the housing element that you've seen recently. So just wanted to acknowledge those people as well. So let me just flip through the first couple of images here and set the context for the rest. Again, we want to talk about sort of the challenge here today, both in terms of how it rests within our work plan and also the context in terms of the sort of economic dynamics of the region of San Francisco as we see it. Remind you of sort of our chief housing policy goals that have been reaffirmed and tweaked a bit in the recent adoption of the housing element, and then have that discussion with you about what this raises for you. It certainly has in our minds implications for our work going forward and what the focus there could be. Just to remind you, we set out 4 big challenges in our work plan to be addressed. These are really driving the work plan. And the first among those is the notion that we ought to try our best to remain an equitable and inclusive city. And the point for showing you this again is to remind you that that's not only about housing. Housing policy has to work in concert with protection of living wage jobs primarily. One of those tools is the protection of so-called PDR space in the city. But there are many other programs that are associated with that goal in terms of education and training, job force readiness, and so forth. But also the equitable access to transportation, which is not the same in all parts of the city and not for all people in the city. And the notion about making whole communities that have schools and neighborhoods and parks, neighborhood facilities and parks is also a key component. If we're going to keep middle income people and families in the city. That's an important part of this agenda as well. That said, we're going to dial in on the housing component today. And I wanted to just, I think Ted will talk more about this in a few moments. I wanted to say that, I sort of covered that, never mind. I just wanted to sort of set a little bit of what I see as the larger dynamics that are driving this discussion. We are not in a sort of stable environment where we can tweak a little bit of housing policy this way or that way. We're really in an extremely dynamic environment now. And part of that is because San Francisco Bay Area is really emerging not just as an important U.S. city, but as really a global hub for technology and innovation. That's drawing a lot of capital, a lot of workers, a lot of high-income workers, and therefore the job growth and the demand for housing is accelerating at an unprecedented rate. I mean, we could probably think of a couple of other periods in history, the Gold Rush and the Second World War shipbuilding era. This is akin to that kind of burst in the economic growth and stature of the Bay Area. So that's just the level of activity is extremely high. There is, in addition to that, at least one important demographic trend, which is that the millennials and baby boomers, the most mobile parts of the population, are really seeking out living in the core of cities, in the core of metropolitan regions. And so you're seeing that sort of locational preference as well. And that is actually driving, of course, the location of companies here as well, which then in turn engenders more workers. All of this adds up to a fairly substantial displacement effect, and you'll hear some pretty startling numbers from Ted in a moment about, we tend to think of how much population we've gained every year over the last 5 years, which is about 10,000 people a year. As a footnote, we've been producing maybe on average 2,000 to 3,000 housing units, maybe a year. So probably in the last 5 years, we've added 50,000 population. I think, John, you've said that it's about 7,000 or 8,000 housing units. So there's a disproportion there in terms of our production. But the more revealing numbers have to do with the churn in that population, which is to say that 10,000 per year we've been gaining every year for the last 5 years is a net number. And the amount of people actually coming to the city is far greater, around 70,000, which means we're losing 60,000 people each year from the city. We're still digging into the information. My sense is that the gain in population is relatively at higher income levels and the loss is relatively at lower income levels. So this really does go to sort of the soul of the city question, who are we? And you'll have some numbers about that in a moment. A key point here is that I think we need to have local solutions that are quite good for both preservation and for production, but we also need to partner with the rest of the region to tackle this issue. I see some nodding of heads, so I hope I'm making sense here. Of course. So we could distill it in this way. This is a little bit dramatic on purpose, which is to say, as the Bay Area grows and its economy continues to enlarge, we could easily see ourselves as the Manhattan of the region. That is to say, we're the place for the most jobs and the highest income people and the very lowest income people and the middle class, and most of the workforce lives around us. That's certainly kind of the trend it looks to be that we're on. Another view of the future could be through deliberate efforts on our part that we remain a very diverse city in a polycentric region. That is to say that other areas of the region, whether that's Oakland or Richmond or the South Bay, actually grow in terms of job growth and help fill out the housing need and so forth. So a couple of different views of the future. Those are sort of a bit extreme on purpose, just to provoke a little bit of thought. And finally, I want to just say something about the role of the Planning Commission. You clearly are the body that sets housing policy through the general plan and through a variety of regulations and ordinances that you promulgate, but you have a big influence as well on city programs, including those in the Mayor's Office of Housing and others. You have your hands on the levers of specific kinds of regulations and incentives, including, as we mentioned, the PDR protections and incentives for more, the transportation services fee, affordable housing requirements as inclusionary, potential new programs around affordable housing bonuses and accessory dwelling units and so forth and so on. These are really important, again, on that new supply question. And you also have project approvals that come before you every week, which is another piece. And finally, the monitoring and evaluation is a very critical role because we need to know how well we're doing and do a better job of that. John and I got this morning, I think, or last night, a list of the reports that we produce just on sort of mostly on the pipeline and on the housing inventory, and it's astonishing how much data we actually are reporting out. And you are the primary recipient of that information, which is also, of course, publicly available. But that's a key role for you to learn and reflect and adjust policy going forward. That's a high-level view of your role, and part of what we want to talk to you about is your role and what that should it change, should it expand, should you delve into some other questions and expand your toolkit. And the toolkit conversation, as I mentioned, we'll be saving for the next round. So I'm going to introduce Kirsten now to take you through more of the context piece, both in terms of some of the trend numbers that I alluded to, as well as sort of a picture of our current housing stock. So, Kirsten.
Thanks, Gil. Commissioners, Kirsten Dissinger with the Citywide Division. Thanks for having us today to talk about affordable housing policy. As Gil suggested, we really are seeing this as the center of our challenge to remain equitable and inclusive city. And national and local media is flooded with analysis about our housing market, our growing disparity, displacement issues, as well as many suggested goals and solutions. So it's clear that we are in a housing crisis. And the city has done a great deal to act immediately in response to the housing issues. We have long had an inclusionary housing program. We've more recently established the Housing Trust Fund. We've rezoned a large portion of the city, and with that, increased the affordable housing requirements and fees. Also, as part of our plan, so you know about all of this work, but sometimes when we're in our conversations about what are we doing and what can we be doing, we kind of lose sight of all the progress that we've made recently. And we continue to work hard on this. I think at the housing inventory hearing, you asked for a quick update on the mayor's working group, so I'm going to do that quickly before I get into our conversation about long-range planning and policy. So there are 3 groups in the mayor's working group. The first was around regulatory updates, process improvements. Much of that was accomplished through implementation of the mayor's executive directive, though it did call for some minor changes to our planning code. Most of those would result in a slight reduction in the demands on our current planning staff time. So you'll see that legislation in the coming months. The second group was the resources group, which was really tasked with identifying more affordable dollars. And that group is continuing to work on developing what we're calling a catalyst fund, which would help with the production of affordable housing, providing more resources. The team is being led by the Office of Economic and Workforce Development, but they are currently working with private partners that have established similar type funds in other cities. They're feeling really positive about their progress and hoping to come before this body this summer or early fall to give you an update on their proposal once they kind of have that baked. And they think in the next year or so, we'll actually have that tool launched. And then last, and probably the one you've heard sort of the most about, is the legislative team or group, which was working on a few different pieces. First, led by staff at MOHCD, is an effort to kind of update Section 415, the Affordable Housing Program. As you know, currently project sponsors have 3 options. They can pay a fee, they can provide affordable units on-site, or provide units off-site. Very few have elected to provide the off-site units. So MOHCD with a task force is taking a look at how to improve that option and make that a more attractive incentive. Also, they are taking a look at the levels of affordability that program targets. Right now, rental units are for 5% AMI and owner units for 90% of the area median income. And so they're exploring options to provide project sponsors an opportunity to provide a higher number of units at different income levels. Both of these proposals, they'd like to come back at our next hearing. As Gil suggested, we'll be talking about policies at our next hearing on this series, and they'd like to come and present the details of those proposals. And And then finally, the legislative group had another task, which is being led by the planning department and our team at the housing policy team, which is looking at potential incentives and bonuses that could be offered to project sponsors who provide affordable housing. This program will in part refine San Francisco's implementation of the state density bonus law. But we're also exploring ways to align this with the city's policy goals, including Prop K. We're currently completing our analysis phase with consultants David Baker and Libby Seifel, and we're hoping to have a proposal in the coming months. So as I said, we're really trying to keep you thinking about the long range, but I know that was a specific request to hear what's going on with the different pieces in the mayor's working group. And the big punchline is that city staff and the stakeholders that were pulled together are really moving forward on sort of the most promising ideas of that work. But today we want to invite you to take a step back from the rapid-fire conversations about our toolbox and specific solutions and engage in a broader conversation about our city's goals, housing goals. As long-range planners, we think beyond the solutions for now and about the long-term implications of this housing crisis on our city's future. We're starting today with a discussion of the policy goals and long-range planning goals for San Francisco's housing. And as Gil said, we'd like to come back in a month and talk more about those tools. At that time, MOHCD could provide more information on the specific request about the affordable housing pipeline. And I want to add that Sophie Hayward is here for questions, as is the Deputy Director of MOHCD, Kate Hartley. So some have asserted that San Francisco is experiencing a housing crisis now because we did not adequately plan for the uptick in demand of housing. We did not adequately stabilize our existing residents and housing supply. Essentially, we did not plan ahead. My goal today is to build on our current work to address today's housing needs, to start a conversation about what we can be doing and what our housing might look like in 2040. So this slide is about let's start by thinking about who we are today. And I wanted to just point out that I worked closely with Audrey Harris, who presented the housing inventory and the housing element and did all of our data work. And she's here to kind of answer those questions. But what we are trying to do, and I think we heard a lot about this at your housing inventory hearing, is pull all of this information together and actually tell a story about what's going on in our housing market. And Ted's going to do a little bit more detail on this, but I want to just say that the slides and the details we have on this slide could be about almost any major city in America today. San Francisco's trends are more intense, but this is largely an urban issue that we're all facing. The Center for Housing Policy, which is a national think tank, published a report on the national housing landscape in 2015. And all of these trends are mentioned, and they're all felt more intensely in San Francisco. It's not, and as Gil mentioned a lot, it's not a San Francisco issue, it's a Bay Area issue. When we're thinking long-term policy goals and our responsibilities about housing, it's important to remember that we're at the center of the region. We have planned our growth as a region. The yellow areas show that near transit, every municipality has placed their PDAs, their priority development areas. However, when it comes to housing planning, we're largely working in isolation from each other. And I just want to ask how our role in the region may impact our housing policy decisions. Might we be able to achieve a more equitable, inclusive city by working with our neighbors? Workers in our city are making a variety of incomes. Who are these workers, and how do they relate to our housing supply? There are some housing implications for this spread of workers. We want a diverse set of employees in our city. Long have housing policies thought of keeping teachers and emergency workers in our cities. But as we grow to a more sophisticated region, is it important we make sure to have room for a variety of employees to maintain diversity in the residents, to reduce the burden of commuting on individuals, and to reduce the burden of long commutes on our infrastructure and environment? We need to revisit our thinking about essential workers for San Francisco to house. We continue to monitor the trends around salaries and wages in the Bay Area and the city, but we know that roughly a third of our households earn less than 50% of the area median income, and roughly a third earn 150% or more, and that disparity is growing. And not all of them can afford to live here. Rent burden is an important sort of metric when we think about it, our housing strategies. We know that our rents are rising, but it's affecting some households more severely. According to the Center for Housing Policy, the ratio of median income to median rent in San Francisco is nearly 45%. We're just above New York, and the only city above us is Miami. So we're seeing that lower-income households, such as waitstaff, office clerks, and customer service representatives, are suffering the most from suffering higher rent burdens, which is just defined by paying more than 30% of your income in rent. And it's no surprise that the very low income are earning the least, and then they're paying the most of their income. But we're also seeing that larger households in the low-income category are more acutely impacted by the rent burden. And this is sort of a state trend, actually. So 25% of Californians are paying over 50% of their income for housing costs. And we know our population is growing, but it's not growing evenly. We're seeing changes in the demographics around age. Right now, our city is a host to a number of young adults. We're calling them millennials, which is a cohort that is larger than the baby boomers. They marry later, and they prefer urban living. This has implications for the kinds of housing we might need for today. The nation is seeing the same demand and responding with low-cost housing near transit. But also, in just 15 years, we are projecting major growth in the senior population. The uptick in seniors is a national trend. What does this mean for our housing supply? Seniors will also have unique housing needs, both in the housing, type of housing, location, and affordability. And at the heart of our concerns about equity and inclusivity, we are also seeing that some populations, some communities are leaving the city, and we are losing diversity. PolicyLink recently completed an equity study of the Bay Area, which concluded that by 2014, assuming we do nothing to address this trend, San Francisco will be the whitest county in the region, have the lowest amount of diversity. As they pointed out, this is a major shift for San Francisco from 1980, when we had the highest diversity, and a stark contrast to the overall trends in the state and the nation for greater diversity in our population. Race and ethnicity is a critical part of any conversation about equity and inclusivity, and a more complicated component to address through housing policy, which generally includes tools that address income. The city should take this challenge of equity and inclusivity seriously. So again, long-range planning for housing means thinking about who we are and who we want to be. Our team feels that at least these three metrics are important for who we want to be. We anxiously await commission and public comment on more ways to think about this. And then just quickly on our housing stock. There's nothing new here. We've tried to provide just sort of a census of our housing stock. As you can see, some of it is guaranteed to be affordable by owners, but most of our housing stock is not price controlled. And on rent control, as Gil said, we have Robert Collins here to answer any questions, but it is a large portion of our housing stock that could be under rent control. Some of them might be affordable depending on when people moved in or how long they've occupied the units. But certainly that is an important tool for helping us maintain our diversity. But we don't have a lot of information about our rent control housing stock. We know roughly how many units are under the program, but we can't say for certain what the stock offers in terms of affordability, nor have we thought through what role this housing stock might play in 30 years. And the same is true of our owner-occupied housing units. They are not subsidized. We know a bit about this housing stock, as sales costs and dates are publicly recorded, but we really don't know how to understand what role it plays in our affordability. Certainly a housing unit purchased in 1979 would have lower carrying costs, but is it affordable for the occupants? Are they retired seniors? Are they a family of 6? Are they a dual-income family with no children? What will that unit be like in 30 years for our housing stock? If we take a closer look at that stock, perhaps by neighborhood, we might be able to think more clearly about how to manage that housing stock to meet our goals. So we have roughly 380,000 housing units today, and our mayor's goal and our RHNA goals all talk about adding roughly 7% to that. So I'm trying to really emphasize here that our existing housing stock that we have right now is an important part of our long-term thinking about housing solutions. And Ted Egan is here for the city's chief economist, and I'd like to just take a minute to have him talk about some recent trends in the housing market he's observed.
Thank you, Kirsten. Excuse me, and good afternoon, Commissioners. Ted Egan with the Controller's Office of Economic Analysis. The Planning Department has asked me to join you this afternoon and brief you with some research that we've done lately that connect to a lot of the things that Gil and Kirsten have said in relation to the nature of the housing market in San Francisco now, the relationship between prices, affordability, the movement of populations, and also some research we've done on the impact of both affordable and market rate construction on affordability. That sounds like a lot, but I really won't take more than about 5 minutes of your time. If we could go to the transparencies, I've brought paper today. This is a chart that sets a bit of context looking at supply and demand and price factors. It's a chart showing three things. The gray area chart is basically the annual growth in what I think is the best measure of housing demand in San Francisco, which is basically household income. Income is what you spend on housing, and when that grows, and it's been growing at upwards of 10% a year during this economic cycle, that places pressure on housing prices. By contrast, the bars are the city's annual increase in housing supply, measured by new building permits divided by the total stock of housing in the city. So since 2010, we've had essentially 5 to 10% annual growth in demand, and we've seen supply growing in the 0.5 to about 1.5% per year. So when you have demand growing rapidly and supply growing much less rapidly, that's where price rises come from. The line there is Zillow's estimate of housing prices in San Francisco annually, and it's grown 40% since 2011. The rents, market rents in San Francisco tend to follow housing prices pretty closely, although I've not shown rents on this chart. So essentially we have a story of very high rising housing prices, and Kirsten indicated that what we're seeing around urban housing market pressure is something we see in cities across the country, but San Francisco really is unique. Every year I update a chart that shows where San Francisco's average housing price is and how much it grew in the past year. And for 3 years in a row now, San Francisco has had the highest housing prices of any large city in the United States and among the fastest appreciating housing prices in the United States. So that's not something that's traditional economics. Normally, when your price is way out of whack, your growth slows, people decide not to move there, prices come back down, and there's a reversion to the mean. But as Gil says, there's something very unique about the Bay Area economy and related to our innovation economy and the fact that we're the world center for the technology industry on both where the workforce lives and where the companies locate. San Francisco has become integrated into the region's technology economy, and so we're experiencing both extremely high housing prices and extremely rapid growth in housing prices. And this has two obvious implications for housing affordability. The first, however, we don't necessarily see. We know about, but it's hard to detect because it has to do with people moving out of San Francisco because of how expensive housing is. We know from the census microdata, which allows you to basically look across the United States every year and pick out people who've moved out of San Francisco in the past year. We know how many people have moved out of San Francisco to other locations in the United States every year. And over the 2011 to 2013 period, that's 60,000 people a year, and the majority of them are members of low-income households or below, which would be 80% of area median income or below. A low-income member of a low-income household is about twice as likely to move out of San Francisco during this period as a member of a household with moderate or higher income. About 12.3% of low-income people move out of San Francisco every year. Only about 5.8% of people in higher income groups move out. So when you adjust for other demographic factors, and they do matter, age matters, family structure matters, it does appear that income is a significant factor in whether people move out of San Francisco. The second factor, which Kirsten alluded to, is that the low-income people who do stay in San Francisco have a higher housing burden. We have focused in our research only on the low-income households with at least one member in the labor force. The senior low-income population presents special differences from the labor force low-income population. But if you just look at labor force households with at least one member in the labor force that's low income, that's about 95,000 households in San Francisco. And as you've just seen, although the majority, really the vast majority of rental housing in the city is subject to rent control, the housing burden for these 95,000 households is about 46% of their income on average. The difference between that and the HUD affordability target of 30% works out to about $6,000 per household per year. And in aggregate, that's about $600 million a year that low-income households are spending on rent in San Francisco, in excess of the HUD affordability guidelines. Affordable housing is obviously producing new affordable housing is obviously a major city policy goal, and we have begun to study how affordable housing, at least in our office, affects the affordability problem that faces low-income San Franciscans. It really affects it in two ways. The first way everybody immediately gets: if you're in a permanently affordable unit, you have subsidized housing and you pay an amount for rent that is set based on your income, generally 30%, when everyone else in the market is paying 46%. However, there's another indirect price effect, a price benefit for low-income households that's associated with building a permanently affordable housing. What that really does is take competition out of the low end of the private market, where, as Kirsten showed you, most low-income people get their housing. The more permanently affordable housing you build, the less competition there is for housing at the bottom of the private market. And that makes it easier for people who don't get permanently affordable housing to find more affordable housing in the private market, and that also helps with the affordability challenge. In fact, when we've done the math on this, we think that in San Francisco, the actual value of this indirect effect, when you spread it across all the low-income households that get it, is actually bigger than the direct effect. And that's one of the reasons why, in particularly tight housing markets like San Francisco, where it's expensive to add housing, that building permanently affordable housing is really the most effective strategy you can have for affecting affordability. You can begin to statistically measure the price effects. An additional point I want to make, however, is this price benefit that you get for all low-income households from building affordable housing, that's at risk if demand spills over from upper-income submarkets of the housing market, because supply in that market is not keeping up with demand. And that's something we've certainly seen in San Francisco, where houses that 10 or 20 years ago would be occupied by a lower-income household are now occupied by an upper-income household. Upper-income households have power in the housing market. They generally have the ability to set prices, and their unmet demand does tend to create price pressures, which can erode some of these indirect benefits of permanent affordable housing has for low-income households. We can begin now to measure, we think, both the price benefits of building affordable housing and the price benefits across the housing market of building market rate housing, and begin to talk about, given what we've seen in the way of income growth in San Francisco, what the actual effects of different combinations of building affordable and market rate housing has on the affordability challenge that faces low-income households in the city. And I'm going to represent that with this chart here, which is basically a line, and if you're on the sort of left and lower side of that line, and the axis here are how much affordable housing the city builds in a year, and on the other, the horizontal axis is how much market rate housing the city builds in a year. According to our analysis, any year that the city's on the left lower side of that line, the affordability challenge on average is going to get worse. We basically need to be on that line or above it to not have the affordability challenge, this 46% number, this out-migration problem getting worse. It actually doesn't really matter if you choose building a relatively lot of affordable housing and not so much market rate, or building a lot of market rate and not so much affordable. They're going to wind up having both affect the housing, the price of housing in San Francisco to the same degrees. But what's I think important is if you look at how much housing the city has built, even this decade, and I apologize for the lack of clarity here, but I'll at least tell you what this chart's saying. What I've done is mark here these gray dots are how much affordable and market rate housing the city's built in each of the years of this decade. This is what we did in 2010, this is 2011, this is 2012, and this was our biggest year this decade, 2013, where we built about 1,300 market rate units and about 700 to 800 affordable units. None of that level of housing production is sufficient to to address the demand that we've seen during this period. The good news is the housing element establishes housing production targets, both affordable and market rate, for the 7 years starting this year. And if we achieve those targets, we will begin to move in the right direction. But I think the important thing from this chart is if the city wants to leverage the price effects of building housing to improve the affordability challenges that face low-income households, it's kind of not so much a matter of picking affordable or market rate as building more market rate and affordable housing compared to what we have been doing. So I'm going to turn it back to Kirsten, and I'm certainly available to answer any questions.
Thank you. Very interesting.
So thanks, Ted. I'm just going to really quickly talk a little bit about what our role might be moving forward and how we might think as a planning commission and planning department about long-range planning for housing. First, we already have a policy framework. Jonas, if I can get the overhead back. We already have a policy framework, and that is the housing element, which was adopted in 2014. It has key issues. These are issues that we spend a lot of time with the community identifying. We think they're a really solid framework. You just reapproved it. The ones at the bottom are San Francisco specific, so we added that on to what the state requires. We think this is a solid framework. So when we're talking to the Planning Commission about what are we wanting to do in terms of long-range planning, we're starting from the platform of all the work we've done in response to the crisis and the 2014 housing element. But the housing element is a housing strategy, and the Brookings Institute, which is another national organization, has taken a look at the past 70 years of affordable housing planning, which is a microcosm of that. And you can see that many of the areas that they're talking about focusing are very similar to what we identified in our housing element. However, there's two that I'd really like to draw your attention to, two areas that I think we have sort of an opportunity to work together as we move forward. The first is thinking about making our existing housing stock affordable and available. And then the second is really thinking about promoting balanced metropolitan growth, so regional growth. Let's participate in those two different pieces. And those, I think, are the frontier for our long-range planning and affordable housing. And we need to think about the 30-year and the 40-year. Our housing element, as Ted pointed out, is an 8-year target for production, and our policies reflect that. But we need to start looking beyond that so that, and I'd like to take a look at I'd like us to think about how the 5 core areas that Gil identified in the citywide work program fit within the housing work framework, especially when we address this question of equity and inclusivity. So we've really pulled out 4 sort of suggestions that we think are some steps we might want to consider. First is understanding our existing housing stock a little better. What is affordable in our stock, and how do we keep it affordable? And then once we understand the stock better, we can start to think about policies and programs that can help us reach that goal. And then do we have a goal for our existing affordable housing stock? RHNA, Prop K, they're all talking about percentages of affordability for new growth. That makes a lot of sense. We have a lot of control in that arena. Our tools are more refined, but perhaps it's time to think about our existing housing stock. And then the flexibility, I think, really speaks to the changes in demographics. Now we don't now we're having a lot of millennials. Soon we'll have a lot of seniors. We need a housing stock that can change and grow with that change in demographics. And then finally, and I think this theme has probably come out the most clear in our multiple presentations today, is regional planning. You know what? We're not alone in this economy, and not in our transit planning, and we shouldn't be in our housing planning. Better coordination in the region could help us have a more comprehensive strategy, and it can reduce the stress on our housing stock and increase the choices for Bay Area residents. So these are the 4 points that we've kind of highlighted from our thinking about long-range planning. And I think as Gil said, our real goal today was to inspire a conversation and discussion with all of you, and we'd like to come back in a month or two and kind of dive into the toolkit and respond to anything you have here. But we've thought of a few questions that might kind of start off that conversation. So thanks for listening.
Thank you. Very informative, thank you. Opening up to public comment.
This was one of the most informative presentations we've seen all year, so thank you for the time, research, and energy that you guys put into this. Nice job.
Thank you. Any additional public comment?
Sue Hester, I'm really concentrated on how we keep the housing we have. We are losing it by the thousands from non-implementation of policies. I give you Academy of Art, which is plundering housing and not being held to account for building housing. Secondarily, STRs, which are exploding. And they've taken, between the two issues, the two chunks, probably 3,000 to 4,000 units of housing are lost. I've been reading the minutes of the Planning Commission to understand the implementation of the institutional master plan. There were lively discussions. This is not the first commission to grapple with housing issues. They had up to here in 73, 74, 75, 76, which minutes I'm reading. And the thing that comes into me is the issues that were raised in that time. It was huge issues of displacement of housing by institutions. The commission was grappling with this. This is the Alioto Planning Commission, which was not a radical planning commission, and the Moscone Planning Commission, and Ellen Jacobs, and Dean Macris, and other people. And the minutes are different from anything you have ever seen. They actually present what was said at the commission meetings by the public as well as commissioners. And they were really grappling with displacement of housing in the 70s, hugely. And they adopted amendments to the Planning Code to force commissions to really grapple with these issues. It came from Doug Engman, who was eventually also on the Planning Commission, Calvin Welsh, other people, Spur, Sierra Club, myself. I was in law school at the time. I was only at a couple of the hearings. But big issues about how you survive in the city. The other place where there was a really concentrated debate was in the late 70s and early 80s, when we had the first remnants of a housing requirement that came from the public. It didn't come from the Planning Commission, and I would ask you to open your eyes. People on this side of the aisle sometimes have valuable things to say. It's not, excluding the first lane. Their staff people think they have the entire wisdom. They don't. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Peter Cohen from Council of Community Housing Organizations. I was not around in the Moscone days, so I won't cite that far back, but Staff is anxiously awaiting public suggestions on how we can achieve these big three goals. That's great. It'd be nice to have more of a workshop style. We're going to run out of 3 minutes. It'd be good to sit down and talk this through. It's one of the reasons why I feel like the city right now in a moment of crisis isn't really doing good policy setting. It's just kind of shooting from the hip. And I don't say that to be disparaging, but there's too much going on too fast with essentially no venue to talk about it and to actually think intelligently, even if we were to put political agendas aside. So at least this is a scratching at the surface. What's remarkable is how the staff, and particularly Ted, and I asked him for his presentation, continue to focus on supply. And we've had enough panel discussions about supply and demand and the elasticity and whether or not that's an affordable housing strategy that I don't feel like it's worth repeating that here. But I need to emphasize what Ms. Hester just said, is that right now where we are, if you want to take supply as your window, fundamentally it's about preserving existing supply of housing that's meeting low and moderate income needs as much as it is about adding new supply. At best, we are spinning in place. If you look at some of the data that's been crunched and you look at all the housing units that have been taken out of rent control and otherwise taken off the market over the last 7 years versus how much we've produced, we've barely gotten ahead. So the fundamental problem is how do you have policies and interventions that deal with preserving supply, if we're going to take a supply paradigm, as much as about pumping out more units. And that supply is being eroded by conversions to TICs. We have a condo conversion program that measures that. But the TIC conversion is out of control. It's hundreds, if not thousands. We have zero regulations in the city about that pace. You've heard about pied-à-terres and other non-primary residents. It's gone from 3,000 units 10 years ago to nearly 9,000 or 10,000 units now. That's a lot of supply taken off the market. Short-term rentals, the Budget and Legislative Analyst's Office just came out with a report today saying perhaps 23 or 25% of existing rentals on the market have now been lost to vacation rentals permanently. SRO conversions to tech hubs, so to speak. We're losing this kind of supply, so I just want to emphasize that very important. The other thing about the supply argument that's again frustrating is thinking of all supply in kind of a macro, as though it's just a number of units of housing versus numbers of bodies of people. You really have to look at supply by income level. Your own housing inventory 3 weeks ago showed you the total disparity of supply at different income levels. That, I would suggest, is the more important supply question than just the total number of units. It's being called jobs housing fit. And there's some very good research coming out of UC Berkeley and UC Davis about a jobs housing fit. How are you creating supply at the income needs that are necessary, not just total units? I would suggest you really look at that. And lastly, housing balance. It's about proportional relationship between the different income categories and whether that's creating stability. Good conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there any additional public comment? I think I have one card from an Elizabeth DeZag.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth DeYoung. I'm a Mission resident. I've been living in a Mission for many years. I live in a rent-controlled apartment. Very glad to have my apartment. Just to let you know, the people who live in the apartment underneath me, there are 2 rented units that my owner actually bought the previous tenants out. Now they're both renting them for $7,500 a month in the Mission. In our neighborhood, you can see, it's all over the papers. Everybody knows what's going on in Mission. Now they're saying that Airbnb or short-term rentals account for 40% of the so-called vacant units. The other problem that we face is, besides the fact all these tech people have so much money and they can come up with a year's rent in advance and outbid all the other people who are looking for apartments, we have absentee loaner problems. We are paying our hard-earned money to owners who don't live in the city. And so that income from hardworking people like myself is being drained out of the city and spent someplace else. One other final problem I would like to mention is international investment. In my neighborhood, I see these guys coming from Japan, from China, from European countries with their portable computers looking at buildings, and we know what's going to happen to those buildings if these people decide to buy them. Right now, real estate is a big place to park your money. It could be a short-term place to park your money. So all they're interested in is making the quick, fast buck, and our city does nothing to protect its citizens in the face of this kind of onslaught of international capital. Thank you very much.
Commissioners, hi, Justin Allen Ryan again. I just wanted to join the other gentlemen in saying that I thought that was a really informative presentation, that there's a lot of discussion in the community that maybe we are using fuzzy figures, and I actually thought when there was this graph up here with sort of a diagonal line that said when we're here we're bad, when we're here we're good, that's a fantastic way to try and present to the tech community. Like that is like what life in a tech startup is every day. Like this graph is good, this graph is bad, fix it. I'm an organizer of San Francisco Data Science Meetup, and I would welcome anyone who wants to try and bridge that community to contact me at bitmonk@icloud.com. It might not work, but I even personally, I'm a non-native and I'm part of the industry, and I find it difficult often to discuss this without seeing red, in which cases I very rarely make a very effective argument or change anyone's mind. So maybe talking to the data scientists is a good way to start. Anyway, thanks for listening again.
Thank you. Is there any other public comment on this item? Okay, not seeing any public comments closed, and opening up to commissioners. Commissioner Antonini.
Thank you for a very good presentation. I think we have to look at this whole question in a couple of very important ways that weren't mentioned. First of all, we're macro managing or trying to macro manage micro solutions, because each individual, each family makes their own individual choices where they're going to live. And they're not necessarily always forced out. I've had dental patients for 45 years, and usually they make very studied choices. They're all different income levels, and of course cost is a factor in it. But there's a lot of other things that influence people's choices. The size of the housing we need, where we can find it at that cost, are we having children or not, where can I go if I'm not currently making what I want to make, or jobs are drying up, where I can move to a place where there are jobs and there's work for my particular skill set. So the 60,000 people who leave San Francisco every year, according to the statistics we've heard, are often doing it in a very studied and logical way. And this is compounded by the fact we're a tiny peninsula with water on three sides, and there, are strict borders, and it doesn't look like we're going to be annexing any more land very soon. So, many of these people, and I can give you records from my charts, have moved to places like Pacifica, South San Francisco, Daly City, Brisbane, places where they're probably closer to jobs they might have in San Francisco than they might be in parts of San Francisco. So, we look at this as this huge loss of people where it's a regional problem, and trying to look at affordable issues only in San Francisco and treating ourselves like an island doesn't make any sense. I mean, we have to work with other areas, particularly those that are close to us, to provide enough housing at all different levels as we try to do, which oftentimes where there's more land and, lower costs for the land, it makes a lot more sense to do that. Along those same lines, I was looking at the statistics for the changes in San Francisco, and we sort of are using the year 2000 as a baseline. City's been around for 175 years or more or less. So, the income, ethnic composition of the city, to take that just from the last few years is kind of a disparity, because San Francisco has been different for most of that period from what it is today as far as its income status, relative number of peoples at income levels, ethnic certainly a lot different. So, I mean, I don't think we can micromanage where people are going to live to a certain degree. All we can do is try to do the best we can to provide enough housing that the demand on the existing housing is minimized. As Mr. Egan said, and it makes total sense, unlike some speakers who tried to come up here, if you build, the high-income people are here, and they're going to continue to be here, and they're going to continue to come here. Carl Nolte said in this week's Chronicle, it's like trying to stop the tides from coming in to stop the demand. The demand is here for a lot of very good reasons. people are migrating to innovation centers, particularly in the United States and particularly in places like San Francisco or Seattle, or there are 3 or 4 others, but we're probably the very top one. And so that's going to continue. And if you don't build housing for them, they're going to buy or rent the existing housing. And they'll always find out a way of doing it, no matter what we do. In a free country, they're still going to figure out a way to do it. So that's the first thing that's important. Also, as an aside, I looked at your ethnic changes over the years, and I noticed that people of Hispanic origin were actually up 7% in the last 13 years. So to those who say they've lost Hispanic populations from the mission, that may be the case, but they obviously have moved to other parts of the city. Or it may not be the same people, but, you know, often groups historically in the mission and other areas that are very dense and very crowded and older housing, as groups pass from generation to generation, they move into other parts of San Francisco where they can get a single family house, they can get a little more space, they'll probably get less cost. So it's more of a shifting than a crisis. I mean, I think people make decisions, and I think we can do a certain amount to try to remedy this, but it's going to work itself out as long as we produce enough housing and keep it clean and safe, and that's my biggest concern. And the other thing that was brought up, and my final point is, when we talk about solutions, I think we can build a lot more affordable housing at higher income levels, which would be income levels of middle class, which is the group that has been lost from the city more than any other, particularly those with families. And if you're trying to subsidize a unit for someone who's making, like, aggregately husband and wife $120,000, it's a lot less of a subsidy than it is for a very low income unit that has to be sold or rented at a very low level. So to require a higher affordability at a higher, as the income level goes up, makes sense, because it's a lot more doable, and it will address that same group that may be leaving the city or competing for some of the existing housing stock. So those are some of my quick takes on the whole thing, but I think we're not going to change what is happening. We can try to adjust our policies to try to moderate that and try to work to allow as many people as possible to stay in San Francisco, but not everybody who works here, not everybody who wants to live here is going to be able to stay here indefinitely. And a lot of times they don't want to, because they can get a lot more elsewhere.
Commissioner Richards.
I made several notes here, so please bear with me. I was running faster than I think my mind was able to keep up with. But incredible item, I think, on the agenda this week. It really speaks to, I think, what the role of the Commission can do in terms of giving ideas. Very, very informative, and I very much appreciate it. I will call on Mr. Egan later, but I would appreciate the slide set that you laid in front. Maybe give it to Secretary Onen. A couple of thoughts before I actually go into kind of like the punchline that I'll say is, one, transportation was brought up. It's a key issue. There was a New York Times article last August or July around low-income people and how transportation actually keeps them at the low-income rung, because they spend so much of their time trying to get to and from where they actually earn their income. These are people that actually have a job, right? It also said that it kind of perpetuates some social impact issues. So single mother takes a long time to go to her job and come back. She has a child. She has to find child care. The child's left alone, things happen, the child starts doing some things that potentially aren't so good without some parental control. So there's also a social impact of transportation. And the last one there is environmental impacts, right? You have to go far to your job and come back. It doesn't make any sense. As we saw in the Fisherman's Wharf area, lack of transportation is a business issue too. They can't staff enough workers, we heard, to run some of the retail stores in Fisherman's Wharf because we have bad transportation. And even though people do want those jobs, they can't get there. Second issue, enforcement. I'm a big advocate here. I talked to Supervisor Kim last night. I mentioned it to Supervisor Wiener, and I know Mr. Powers is in the back of the room. We need to use a little bit more stick and a little less carrot on the enforcement. I've talked to some developers who I would say, basically the words to me were, some of the penalties that we get for breaking the rules are kind of already included in the cost of doing business. And that's really, I think, really incenting people to do things that we don't want them to do. So increasing fines for things around land use issues, I think, are needed. Converted PDR space, come back and ask for forgiveness is a lot we're seeing. We sat in a room full of people in the Mission last night. I think they had 10 addresses where PDR space was being converted to office. And the question I have is, is it going to come to us to ask for permission to convert it, or is there going to be some type of fine and actually have it reversed? So it's a real issue, especially in that neighborhood. Seniors were mentioned, another New York Times article around design issues in projects. So, as I had my mother's 90th birthday here when we were on our December 4th hearing, right? For her to get from the street into here with nowhere to sit, et cetera, there are issues. And I think when we look at projects as well, we should be looking at them through a lens of how can everybody have equal access to the project. You're not officially designated as a handicapped person, but you do have mobility issues. And the more, as I grow older, I also feel that happening to me, right? So we need to look at those kind of things in design when we do design, especially in public areas. I guess the question I have, Mr. Egan, what I heard you say was, what I heard you say, correct me if I'm wrong, on the affordable housing numbers, we're kind of damned if we do and damned if we don't. If we don't build market rate housing, then affordability is impacted by higher wage, if you could come up, that would be great. Higher wage earners going after what we would have considered heretofore more affordable housing, right? However, if we don't build market rate housing, a big chunk of our affordable housing also is impacted because that's a vehicle to get affordable housing built, permanently affordable housing built through market rate housing. Is that a good paraphrase?
Actually, Commissioner, that's, I think, probably true, but that second point was not one that I made.
Okay.
The only point I was trying to make is that if we build permanently affordable housing, the household that gets that housing has an obvious and immediate benefit.
Right.
If we can keep demand from upper income households at bay, from spilling over and occupying housing that was previously occupied by low-income households, then there is an opportunity for a price benefit that's specific to low-income households. So it can target it directly at the group in San Francisco that is the highest affordability challenge. The problem we have in doing that is there's so much demand growth at the upper end that essentially is outstripping what the city has done in terms of keeping up with the demand for market rate housing.
So when we look at the pipeline report and we see we've produced 200% of higher income housing, market rate housing than we need, that number might actually be low, according to what you just said.
I believe that concept of need comes from the RHNA process. It doesn't come from what's necessary to move the affordability needle in San Francisco.
Okay. I had no political agenda there. I'm just trying to, I know there's other ways to get affordable housing too, but you have to piece these all together to get what you get. Another question I have is turnover of rent-controlled units. To me, when they turn over, you're really basically taking the rent-controlled unit off, the affordable rent-controlled unit off the market. Case in point, I have a friend who's a Latino. He lives in the Mission. He pays $1,200 for a junior one-bedroom. He's going to be leaving in June. They're going to be advertising it for $4,500. It's rent-controlled, but at $4,500, nobody can afford it, not even some of the tech workers that are moving here. So that's something I think you need to do. I'd like you to include in your data analysis, Mr. Kelly, as well, if you can.
Oh, well, we certainly have included that. I mean, the reason why you have low-income people spending 46% of their income on housing in a city where 85% of the rental stock is rent-controlled is because it's vacancy decontrolled.
Exactly.
And I can assure you there will be someone, we've been studying the rental market very closely, someone will pay $4,500 a month.
Great, because when you say rent-controlled, everybody thinks cheap.
Not in California.
Before 1979 doesn't make it cheap. Okay. And I guess I have a question. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I guess for Mr. Cohen, please. So I sat in a room of folks in the Mission last night, and we were talking about different ways to fund affordable housing. They were talking about the impact of market rate housing on rents and displacement, et cetera, evictions. And the topic came up around the Affordable Housing Nexus study. And do you think there's a clear way to draw any distinction between market rate housing and those two ills, displacement and rising rents on affordability? And if you do, how would you go about doing that?
Right. I mean, this has been, there's an intuitive nexus.
Right.
How to actually study it. It's called indirect economic displacement or indirect displacement. And it's something we've actually talked a bit with the planning department about it, and it's come up in the past. I think there's some nibbling around the edges of research that's been done on this, not in San Francisco, but on the topic. And I mean, I think it's actually the type of study, Director, that the city should do. I mean, I think it's a question that begs an answer. The challenge, of course, is this kind of causal relationship. Nexus studies typically are saying, you know, something is done and you can actually draw a causal effect on some outcome over here. The idea of rising rents and gentrification displacement as a result of market prices that are rising as a result of capital investments that are, say, down the street, and yet rental housing a block away goes up in price, to draw that correlation in a causal way to say that there's a mitigation requirement is very challenging. But I think intuitively folks understand that line.
Right. But I think the issue is, for folks intuitively, people want to see more hard data.
That's absolutely.
You know, so I think that's something, if we could at least look at or work on. I know I mentioned this to you the other night. I didn't have a chance to actually, Ms. Deschinger, the other night. I didn't get a chance to go into it, but it's something that, you know, I've been hearing and been thinking about as well.
And just to, Commissioner, to emphasize the point, as challenging as it might be to think of the methodology and the necessary data, I do think from the standpoint of studies, I mean, I feel like some things have been studied to death, and we don't need more studies. That question deserves a study. Okay. It really does. And I think answering, at least from some data standpoint, that begging question, and maybe folks on the community side are proven completely wrong. I mean, maybe there's absolutely nothing that
there's a risk there.
There's no relationship between market rate housing development and rising rents and gentrification displacement. But maybe it actually demonstrates that there is a connection, and we can start moving towards some policy interventions rather than what appears to be as sort of a standoff in terms of an ideological debate.
And I think some of my fellow commissioners might agree with me. That kind of data would be important for us to know, right?
Yeah.
Without the data, it's just you have this he said, she said stuff. I think one of the last question, Mr. Cohen, is there anywhere in the world where a study like that's been done and it's been proven, or would this be the first?
that I don't know.
Director?
Like I said, I think they've been nibbling around the edges. I'm not sure if there's been a definitive study.
Mr. Egan, do you know? No? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. So anyways, I think that's something I'd like to put on our list to really at least examine and try to get funding for via the Board of Supervisors or through budget.
Well, I might just say, I mean, I think the fundamental issue that we're talking about here, and by the way, I have to thank Peter and Calvin and for some recent discussions, and we do want to have, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I do think there's, it's time to have a kind of more, this forum is difficult to have that discussion, and we need to figure out how to do that. But the issue that you're caught is the causal relationship that Peter mentions. Is it the actual construction of new housing that is having the greatest impact, or is it the demand for that housing that is having the impact? That, to me, is the fundamental question, and the point, frankly, where there's some disagreement. I mean, and that's where the challenge that we have right now is that people are moving here even though we're not building housing.
Right.
And so I think that's a fact, right? We can all look at the numbers. The Census Bureau numbers are what they are.
Sure.
So the question is, what is actually causing? And I'm sure there's a number of factors causing prices to increase, but is the cause the demand, or is the cause the actual construction, or is it both?
Right.
And I think that's the question that you're trying to get at. I don't know of such a study.
Okay. So it'll certainly take a lot of the emotion out of it, I hope. And I guess
go ahead.
I'll get one more point, and then I need to wrap up here. I don't want to monopolize.
Yeah, since I'm here, I will say again, I think the other body of research that's really promising is this jobs housing fit analysis, and it is also some new terrain. And Chris Benner, who's now at Santa Cruz and out of UC Davis, and has a whole research team there, as well as Karen Chappell at Berkeley, have been digging into this question, because that's the other real question about supply. I mean, you know, we get up here and we challenge supply all the time, but honestly, just throwing units at the wall is not going to deal with the fact that not everybody makes the same amount of money. And so understanding the fit between a growing workforce, from the janitors to the upper management, and their ability to afford housing, and then how supply is actually coming online to meet that need, is a really important question. That kind of gets to the end of it. How to solve that or control for it is a question of policy interventions and whatnot. But understanding the patterns are very, very insightful, and it's difficult stuff. It's correlating data. I'm sure Ted would tell you that's not necessarily packaged to create that crosswalk. But that kind of methodology is being developed, and I'd suggest you keep it on your radar screens.
Thank you. Thank you. I think to Commissioner Antonini's point, before I took this position on the commission, I actually managed a group of 115 people, mostly here in San Francisco. And a lot of people that I had in my organization, they made a fair amount of money, probably the median, $90,000, but they couldn't afford to live in the city, so they lived as far away as Sonoma. Somebody lived in Gilroy, and the cost of that on the business was a lot of hidden cost around, I have to leave early, I'm late for work because the train was late or whatever, and hey, we'd like you to stay because we have this big meeting. I can't. I've got to get home. There is a cost to the business as well. So I also say it's an economic cost, not just a social cost. And my last thing is here. We have the toolbox to affect change, absolutely, and I think we've got a lot of good intentions. The concern that I have is, in a normal market that's kind of orderly, we could make these changes and we could kind of hit the effects as they come or anticipate them or maybe do them side by side. But in this market, it's like I feel like we're being overwhelmed, and we have this, we want to go this way, but the change is happening so fast that every week we get up here and we approve a project and it's got 12% affordable or whatever. I kind of go to myself, I think Commissioner Wu said it, kind of a course correction. I don't know what that looks like, but to me, the characteristics of it are we need to take theory into action a little faster, a little bit more radical, quickly. It's got to be impactful, but it's got to be thoughtful. So however you can do that in this kind of a bureaucracy would be, you're unlocking the secret to I think, what we need right now. Thanks.
Good comments. Commissioner Wu.
Thank you. I really want to thank staff for this presentation and for President Fong. We've been working with staff on this for, I think, 6 to 9 months, and I'm just so happy that we are finally talking about equity and inclusivity as a goal, that we have talked about displacement. I think even just the fact that we've said these words at the Planning Commission is a small but important victory for me. So I ask that we put this on the website so that there's more access to it to the public. So I want to say that San Francisco has been a leader in dealing with these issues for a long time, and we should continue to push ourselves to continue to be a leader even more. So the fact that the nation is dealing with these challenges and the whole region is dealing with these challenges doesn't mean we shouldn't keep striving to be the best, right? And so our work on inclusionary has been asked about around the nation. I think that more and more cities are looking at inclusionary as an example. When Mr. Kelly first said that there were 60,000 people leaving every year, I trust you as an accurate person, but I thought you said the wrong number. I was shocked. I think for every one person that Commissioner Antonini sees that chooses to move out, I see 3 people that have been evicted, have been harassed, have been forced to move, and I think that that's a very real problem. I do want to ask, I think, is the representative from the Rent Board still here? If we have any numbers on how many rent-controlled units we've lost per year, this may be a tough question. I know that we don't have vacancy control, but I think still having the rent-controlled units, even if they go up to market when a new person moves in, is really important for the stabilization of that person or family. And so if we're trying to shift our thinking more toward the preservation of existing housing and the preservation of those people living in it being able to stay, this is an important question.
Good afternoon. Yeah, I'm afraid the numbers are not what you'd expect because we don't have registration in San Francisco for rent-controlled units. Since we have no vacancy control, there was never a need to institute registration. And so therefore what we have are rough numbers based on units that pay the rent board fee. So when we look at that, the number of, what we're basically taking is the rent board fee and dividing it, the total collections and dividing it by the annual rent board fee, and then we'll get to a number of units that actually paid and did not get a refund of the rent board fee. And we've been tracking that since, or publishing that as one of our performance measures since fiscal year 2006. So in 2006, we had about 180,215 rent board fee paying units. And as of the end of last fiscal year 2014, we had about 173,000 rent board fee paying units. But that number is not great because there are many other possible factors, such as Section 8 units coming out of the Section 8 market and going into rent control, or the other way. and such things.
Okay, thank you. I think even though that's a loose number, it's helpful to get a sense of the magnitude. I wanted to just add a couple more points. So on this question then, I think we're going to have the next discussion about tools, and I think that if there can be more tools for the Planning Commission to talk about how to preserve existing stock, I think that would be very helpful. Right now, it seems like mostly we talk about it when we look at demolitions or conversions, and often we see those as DRs at the end of our calendar when we're all very tired, and so there's not a place to have like a meatier discussion about it. Is it that we should get some sort of consistent reporting on lost units? I'm not sure what it is, but I just like staff to take a look at looking at that. And helping us make the connection between, well, this is now getting into new production again, but helping us make the connection between all of the individual project approvals that we get put in front of us and the topic today. So we spend probably the bulk of our time on individual projects, right? They're not all residential, but many of them are and will be in the upcoming months and years. And I feel like we, I know that the reports look at the general plan or they may allude to the housing element, but it's just not clear how we can really grapple with this issue more when we see the projects week after week. And then lastly, I will make a plug for the region, looking more toward the regional solutions. I don't know too much about ABAG and MTC, but I think that there may be some possibility for us to join with Oakland and San Jose and push the other members of ABAG and MTC to do their part. I think that many of them don't even have complying housing elements. I know that Pleasanton was sued for doing or not doing that. And so I know that there's this disparity at the regional level where we're talking about affordability here, but these smaller cities or mid-sized cities are talking about not even wanting to zone land to do enough housing. And so how can we as the three big cities really push those other cities? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not going to say anything that hasn't been already said, but I think this is kind of the beauty of San Francisco in that all of us have our own sort of idea of how San Francisco should be, and it has a lot to do with how you were brought up or individually where we came from. Some want grassy front yards, some want big grassy backyards, some want no backyard, some want restaurants below them, some want nightclubs next door to them. But that's kind of the beauty, and I think that's what makes San Francisco appealing and attractive to so many people around the world, including international investors. I like the idea of more dialogue, whether it's a workshop format. I'm not sure if 1 more meeting, 10 more meetings is going to solve this. Ms. Hester she began to touch on looking back at the minutes from 1960, 70, 80, 90. And I don't think she maybe got to the point, I think the point you're going towards was that in all of these decades, this problem came up at some point or another. Maybe the real kind of question I have back to you was there ever a solution in each of those decades? There was some movement, and there were some great things that were done, including some propositions, some ordinance that we're facing now that I think were really forward-thinking things like Prop M. But, and just hang on for a second there. But I think what maybe she was trying to get to, or what I heard from her, is that time and history repeats itself over and over. And San Francisco is a great city and a great example of boom and bust, whether it's gold rush to now to .com to now. And there will be a recession. The things will cool off. Things will spike back up again. I want to touch on rent control inventory. And I was really I've been asking this question of what's the inventory right now of rent controlled units. And I'm really surprised to see it's at 46. I think that's actually a lot. The real problem I've always had with rent control is that there are people who are living in rent controlled units that are of very high income. They maybe when they first moved in, they were in starter jobs, but now they've been there for 15 years, 20 years and taking advantage, frankly, I feel. And when I hear that from the rent board that they're not registered, it's kind of back to the Airbnb thing as well. If you're not registering and taking account of them, it's really hard to control and enforce them. But I think this has been a real good spot, a strong point for San Francisco, the rent control units. But I think there are people who are taking advantage of that. and that's part of the inventory that doesn't turn over, doesn't remain. I don't know how we police that. That's a sensitive issue. I do want to hear from Ms. Hester, and if you could finish your thought about how the city's gone up and down through, and you know, you made reference to the people in the first row. Well, there's always been people in the first row in all these decades that you've looked at, and I don't know if any one of them has been able to guide us to an ultimate solution or not, or we've just morphed into the next solution and then the next problem.
What was obvious to me in both reading the minutes and participating in hearings is that planning commissions had to grapple with things, and bit by bit by bit, policies changed. Some of the changes are not on the consciousness of the planning department staff at this point, particularly institutional master plan ordinance, and that was enormously controversial, dealing with the infringement on housing stock by institutions in the city. And once we cut loose the solutions that people came up with after years of struggle, Planning Commission and the public, we're going backwards in solutions. Two big ones was, and they both involved multiple years, institutional master plan, and secondarily, the housing requirement. And now the housing requirement is not being followed because people are turning their head away from conversions. Conversions means housing has to be paid for. So I'm looking at a huge amount of effort that was put in to jobs, housing linkage, and inclusionary housing requirement. Inclusionary housing requirement is at a certain level easier because it's housing, building housing. But when we do conversions a la Eastern neighborhoods, and they don't have to pay for housing, and people bled for housing be required. And if you get away from that position institutionally at the planning department staff level, I'm not putting on the commission, planning department staff level, it's a huge issue. So I'm seeing real struggles being played on legislation, and the issues are disappearing.
Thank you. That wasn't quite the question I was asking. But the one takeaway I have is the comment about building for the next San Francisco. And whatever decade you pick, 2030, 2040, a growing senior population, I just hope, and this is my one request, and I really love this visionary work that we're taking it in chapters and chunks and tackling it that way, and then in the end, hopefully coming back around full circle to see it all. But that we look at that forward demographic. We find out who that is. We're not so reactionary to the millennial right now, but we start to think 2-3 generations out, and so that we don't catch ourselves in this situation, predicament again. Mm-hmm. So, I'm just hopeful that we can take that kind of thought, which means stepping away and getting away from the details for a second, thinking long range and setting ourselves to that goal. Commissioner Johnson.
Thank you. Turning my mic on. I know that there are often times when we have issues that come on the agenda where people will begin to opine and we'll say, that's not what we're here for. Can we just vote? But I really enjoy that we're having this conversation. I mean, this is why I was honored to be, asked to join the Planning Commission, and I'm excited that we're here today. I agree with Mr. Cohen that there are other forums and Director Ram that there are other forums that we should work on and have workshops or other meetings. I mean, even the mayor's working group has been a little bit unwieldy at times. I have participated. So I think we can do some thinking around, can we have smaller meetings or groups? I think we can really get creative with that. We did some into the redevelopment agency, which led to some of the neighborhood plans that are out there and discussions around the DDA, which I thought were extremely helpful. So if anybody cares, I have ideas about how we can do it. I want to key off something that was said in the opening comments that San Francisco's boom and bust, and we went from the gold rush, to World War II, where we had two extremely large changes in the composition, physically and culturally and socially, of San Francisco. And when I look at those two eras, one thing that I notice is that they're hugely different. The gold rush was really chaotic. People were coming from all over the place. Nobody would have even known. If you said, what's the planning code, they would have said, or zoning code. People would look at you like you were crazy because what's that? Down to World War II, which was highly regimented in a lot of cases, institutional planning of large sections of San Francisco. We have Hunters Point as a neighborhood because of World War II. And I think that if you look at those two times, I'm hopeful, as Commissioner Fong said, looking generations down, that we can sort of thread the needle. And we can say that, yes, we can't control all the elements that are coming here. They're not all coming for the same reason. People use the word tech, but that's a lot of companies, a lot of different industries, and a lot of ways of people are coming to San Francisco. I think it would be great if we could start to think about our tools in a much more, again, universal way. I touched on this in my initial comments about thinking about retail space, and now I'll expand it to talk about just planning for San Francisco. I think that we need to find a way to reorganize ourselves, the department, even some parts of the planning code, so that there's much more control over the growth of San Francisco. The fact that we're doing things project by project means we're never going to get there, because we can have all of the policy discussions we want, but if everyone can make their own decisions lot by lot over what they're willing to invest in, what they're wanting to build, and what's going to be there long term, it's going to continue to be a little bit more gold rush and a little less World War II. Sorry, just two more things, and then I'll move on. So I know that we said we're going to have future hearings about the tools for the planning department, and the planning commission. But I'll just say a couple things. First of all, I like the front row. I think you guys are great. I think you all do a fantastic, fabulous job, and you put all of this together for us. And I think that you are, doing a fabulous job. So I'll just say that. I want to key off again, I'm not going to repeat it, but Commissioner Richards took the words out of my mouth that it's not just housing, it's also transit. If we don't connect disconnected neighborhoods, then we're not going to be able to keep housing stock. Because if you have a house on the other side of the city that nobody can get to me, that's not providing housing. So I think that we need to make sure that the MTA is having that conversation, regional transit organizations are having that conversation, and that we are making sure that they are having these same levels of policy discussions that we are having, because otherwise nothing we do is going to work. And then just a couple things, keying up future conversations about tools. I'm going to be a rebel here. I'm going to go out there on a limb and say that I think that we need to step away from the off-site affordable housing requirement. It's not well used. We haven't seen a lot of developers take it up, and even if they do, it's unclear where those units will go. And I really think when it comes to building large amounts of affordable housing and really creating that class of protected housing stock, there needs to be much more of a central hive mind about how we do that. That's just my opinion. And I hope that as the city keeps looking at what tools can we use to fund and incentivize affordable housing development, that we really make sure that we're prioritizing the great affordable housing developers that currently work in this city or that could work at the city, and the work that's already done between the successor agency and the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development to produce units. And if the off-site housing requirement is just this little thing over there that's not really adding anything, I think we need to have hard conversations over whether or not it needs to exist. And that's it for now. I got lots of other stuff, but really it's not, my other comments are much more about tools that the Planning Commission and the department can have.
Commissioner Hillis.
So thank you for this. I'm glad we're finally kind of getting beyond the discussion of whether we build a specific project in Potrero Hill or 8 Washington or wherever, and that's somehow going to solve our problems or not, and look at the big picture, because I think kind of the existing housing stock and what we do with it and how we treat that is much more important than specific projects that come before us. One question on the data, the 60,000 people who are leaving or have left in the last 3 years, how does that compare to 10 years before? I imagine there's people leave every year. But do we know how that compares? That would be good to know. In kind of if we're only building 10,000 units of housing, yet 50,000 people are moving here, where are they going? They're just kind of cramming into existing units. I guess that's it. That's the only place that they could go. It'd be interesting to kind of get more data at the neighborhood level too, to see, whether some neighborhoods are more affordable. Obviously, they are than others, and kind of, where those neighborhoods are. And also looking at other cities and who may be doing things better than us. I mean, I tend to think we're on the forefront of building housing and affordable housing, but there obviously could be ideas elsewhere around the world that are working. And I, again, going back to kind of existing housing stock, two ideas that have struck me as ways, tools and things we can look at. One is rent control, and really looking at who is it benefiting, and what percentage of the population in rent control is 150% or more of AMI, and the question of means testing rent control comes up as an issue. It'd just be good to get the data on that. I know it's shaky political ground to talk about rent control, but as it is Prop 13, but I think things should change. I mean, corporations should be taxed at market rate every year, and I equate people making $200,000 to 200% of mean as probably shouldn't benefit from rent control, just like corporations shouldn't benefit from Prop 13. So it'd be good to see if we know that. I know that data is probably extremely difficult to get, but who is rent control benefiting? And then on kind of housing stock, I was able to talk to Kate Hartley and Mo about the small sites program, and I think that's fertile ground for potential opportunities in the city. You can buy a unit of housing, rent control unit, for significantly less than a cost to build an affordable unit or a market rate unit now. You can buy a unit on the market for $300,000, depending on kind of the size of the building you buy. So should the city, and I think we've started to move into that arena with the small sites program. I know there's kinks that need to be worked out, and it's got to be a better process, but it's a way that land trusts or nonprofits could start acquiring existing units for a lot cheaper than it costs to build a unit, and actually protect people who are in their units now and try to stem the tide of displacement. Clearly, you're not going to buy thousands of units in the next couple of years, but as we look forward, we know this cycle is going to repeat itself in the next decade and the decade after that. How do we start to make real meaningful change? So those are my comments. Thank you.
Director Ram.
Thanks. Just a couple of comments first to thank everyone. I want to particularly thank Gil and the staff for kind of pushing this forward, and the commissioners for actually pushing us to have this discussion. The slide that was interesting to me was the note about whether we should approach this as being the Manhattan of the region, or whether we should approach this as being the kind of polycentric one of many centers of the region. And I think that's a very important slide, and it just compels me to mention the regional issue that I see happening. And if I can get on my soapbox for a minute, which is that it's not San Francisco and Oakland and San Jose who are really not stepping to the plate, because I think we have to give ourselves credit for what we do. In my view, it's the smaller communities in the region who are really avoiding this issue and actively avoiding this issue by not building housing. And because of the tax incentives are exactly the opposite. The tax incentives, because of state tax structure and the way that development works in this state, is that they have great incentives to accommodate commercial development, but little incentive to accommodate residential development. And that is not only contributing to a housing problem, it's contributing to a huge transportation problem for this region. And I just think that there needs to be something other than a carrot to have a broader view of how we build housing in this region.
Commissioner Richards.
Just quickly, I keep recalling the conversation we had in the mission last night with Commissioner Wu and the community leaders there. Somebody said, you're the Planning Commission, can't you make a policy statement on something that concerns you? And I turned to Commissioner Wu and I said, are we allowed to do that? And I think maybe sometime in the future, if there's something that we're very concerned about, we have a strong opinion on it, and we're hopefully near unanimous, it's something that we should be doing instead of reactively advising the mayor and the board of supervisors. Maybe we can proactively advise them as well through some type of a policy discussion or policy resolution. Commissioner Hillis took the words right out of my mouth. I think in terms of the off-site program, I like the idea of actually using the money to actually preserve sites that have people living in them already. It's probably cheaper, and it's more stable, and it should be another option. Thanks.
Commissioner Antonini.
Thank you. Answers to a couple questions that were raised in regards to off-site, how affordable. There have been quite a few of them while I've been on the commission, and many of them have been very good. They're usually coupled to larger projects, and they've added quite a bit of affordable housing, and usually within a fairly close proximity to the market rate project that's been built, and I think they've worked quite successfully. So it's not one that smaller projects opt for that often, but the larger projects do, because they can afford to also build the off-site affordable in a whole different building. So that's one thing. And in terms of fighting over individual projects, that was why we had Eastern Neighborhoods. And I think that we have a really good framework, and Eastern Neighborhoods, many of the projects that have come before us have gone through because they comply, and it doesn't mean every project that complies has to be approved, but I think that it sets the framework after 10 years of use, and so that was a very good thing that we put together, and we have to realize that it's there and honor what was decided. And then finally, I came here in 1968 when I first moved to San Francisco, and I think there are many neighborhoods that, are much safer, cleaner, job generators, and as a result, property values are up. And I think it is because of demand, and it's a good problem to have. I'd rather have that problem than have the opposite problem where nobody wants to work here, nobody wants to have business here, nobody wants to live here, whole parts of cities are being torn down or vacant. And so, I mean, it's a good problem to have. And when I think about, the whole question of whether the demand is driven by building housing, I don't think it is, because areas like Hayes Valley, NOPA, Bernal Heights, Noe Valley, Potrero Hill haven't built a lot of market rate or any kind of housing in those areas, but the property values and the neighborhoods have increased very quickly. So I think that it's because, these areas have been seen as desirable, and that's because there's a desire to come to San Francisco and live here and have businesses here.
Commissioner Moore.
Everything everybody has said is incredible. I think it's one of the most highest levels discussion we had in a long time. Appreciate everybody's contribution. I hope somebody's keeping notes and will distribute them afterwards. What I'd like to add is that I'm impressed by starting a discussion like this with who are we as a city? Really reflecting on your values. Who do we want to be and how do we get there? And then calling on inclusive and equitable policies to guide us along the way, I think requires a high degree of integrity, a high degree of openness to diverse points of view, and I think a lot of strengths, institutional strengths, to look at what has brought us to where we are exactly, including some of the reminders we get ever so often, such as go back to why we have institutional master plans, why we have Prop M and all of those kinds of things. I think they are part of the discussion, need to be re-examined. I like to add just bullet points, not necessarily in the order of importance, but they just came as you were all talking. I'm interested to add the question of rent control reform, rent control update, and rent control enforcement. I heard resonance on that subject. I like to put a strong emphasis on the housing work fit, something we have not talked much about recently because things are moving so rapidly. And lastly, I like to ask the director in particular, there's an article in Wall Street which makes us perhaps understand better why some of the outlying communities, particularly suburban communities, are somewhat hamstrung and not wanting to talk to us. The foreclosure hit has put lots of their housing stock into the hands of banks and Wall Street. And the controls over that housing are not as clear as we might all think. And that has an impact on rents for those houses being controlled as exceedingly and increasingly larger heights. And that puts another strain on those communities to participate in a more level discussion. I saw this article a few days ago. If I still have it, I will forward it to you. You could probably Google it just by using those words, but it's really Wall Street's control over suburban housing and housing ownership.
I saw that.
Commissioner Richards.
One last point. I know Commissioner Antoni brought up Eastern neighborhoods, and I've had some discussions with folks both in the department and in the neighborhood. I know we're going to be having a Mission 2020 plan discussion. I'd love to see the comparison between what Eastern neighborhoods did in the number of years that we have already had it in effect, 8 years or 7 years, as a percent of what it was supposed to do, and what's Mission 2020 compare and contrast. Would be a great kind of idea for us to learn. Thank you.
Commissioner Johnson.
Thank you very much. Yeah, just a quick question, and then another one quick comment. So I think Mr. Egan has left, but I'm going to look at staff and ask a question. Do we look at churn within income levels? So I know we talked about the displacement of 60,000 a year leaving, 70K are coming in. That 60,000 is disproportionately lower income. But have we looked at churn within income levels, like people sort of moving out? I mean, is that part and parcel of that answer, or is that a different question that needs to be answered?
It's part of the same question, and we haven't gotten the information on that yet, but that's part of, I think, one of our basic points today is we want to spend some time and energy digging into this, the current demographics and the current housing stock in general and how it's being used, and that would be a part of that.
Thank you, Gil. Just to put an emphasis on why I think among the million trillion other things that you guys are doing research and getting data on, I think that's important because I key back to, I think there was a woman sitting here saying, the person below her was going to rent their apartment for $7,500 a month. And that's only affordable if you make around $300,000 to $350,000 a year. And I know we talk about high income levels in the city, but most people are not making that kind of money. And what ends up happening is we get truly something that's kind of like what Manhattan used to be like, at least in the 90s, where you come in, you spend all your money on rent, you eat ramen, you endure it for a couple of years, and then you move somewhere else. And I think that's, And that's exactly what's happening. Well, I try to stay away from anecdotes because I know that that's not necessarily data, but that's at least been my experience. My friends make moderate to, good money, but they duke it out for 3 years with roommates paying $2,000 for a room, and then they either move to Oakland or they get a job in LA or they move somewhere else. And I think that is just as important because it means we end up governing a city of transients. That's just as important a question as are we replacing lower income people overall with people of higher income? So as much as we can get the answer to that question, that'd be awesome. And then just quick plug, small sites. I said I was going to leave it to the next hearing, but just I sit on the board of an affordable housing developer. We are actively looking for sites, and it's not just the implementation of the program. It's actually finding suitable sites to get, to buy. So I know I'm looking forward to hearing more information about how that's working out generally. Thanks.
Okay, once again, staff, Mr. Kelly, thank you very much. And I think this is just the first chapter of many deep, good discussions going forward. The commission will take a quick break and we'll reconvene. Or a lunch break.
Extra hour in the morning.
And on that light, we're working on a proposal to really fundamentally change how the city deals with street trees moving forward, and we should have some recommendations coming up at the end of the year. The legislation today is a piece of that solution, helping to streamline the required street tree planting tied to development so that as our neighborhoods grow, they also become greener. Planning and DPW have worked closely on this legislation, and our office is strongly in support of it. We've also added 2 provisions to this legislation, one of which one pertains to billboards and sort of many billboard companies, do the right thing, but others do not and butcher our existing street trees, and so we want to make sure that we added controls to keep our existing street trees healthy. And the other is the requirement that as part of development, which is already a current requirement that developers protect street trees during construction, we're adding a little bit of teeth to that requirement by requiring that they submit a tree protection plan to the Department of Public Works prior to the commencement of construction. So with that, we're open to any comments, and we would respectfully request support today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioners, as mentioned, the ordinance proposes to eliminate the planning department's role in requiring street trees for certain development projects. It proposes to eliminate the planning department's role in assessing and applying an in lieu fee for street trees that are not provided. And it also proposes to amend the Public Works Code to require DPW to assume the implementation responsibilities for street trees, as well as to add permitting requirements for major maintenance for certain trees near billboards, and to require tree protections during construction activity. The planning department staff is in support of the ordinance for the following reasons. As mentioned, the ordinance seeks to streamline the street tree requirement process. The current implementation practice is cumbersome and confusing for the public as it forces project sponsors to shuffle between and coordinate with two agencies' review of the street tree requirement. The current implementation practice is also unnecessarily redundant as it involves two public agencies when arguably it could and should only require one. The proposed changes will streamline the review process, as mentioned, by eliminating the planning department from the process and making DPW as the principal agency implementing the street tree requirement. It's important to note that DPW, it makes sense to have DPW as the principal agency because they have jurisdiction over improvements and maintenance of the public right-of-way, and they have staff with expertise in tree planting and maintenance, as well as with the coordination of sidewalk utilities. This jurisdiction and skill set is unfortunately absent from the planning department. Last, the changes in the ordinance are a product of a multi-month effort between the planning department, the Department of Building Inspection, and the Department of Public Works. The changes in the resulting new processes have the consent of the implementation staff of these three agencies and represent an improvement in how the city will apply the street tree requirement. Department staff does recommend one minor clarifying modification to the ordinance, and that's to amend Planning Code Section 138.1 to explicitly indicate that the project sponsor is the party responsible for the planting and maintenance of any required street trees. The modified section would read as follows. Project sponsors shall plant and maintain street trees as set forth in Article 16, Sections 805A and D, and Section 806D of the Public Works Code. This concludes my presentation, and I am available for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any public comment on this item? Okay, not seeing any. Public comment is closed. Commissioner Antonini.
Yeah, just a clarification for whoever can answer. This is only involving trees being planted in connection with development rather than trees that are already existing in front of somebody's house.
This will definitely affect those trees that are triggered. The requirement is triggered as part of a new development, yes.
Okay, yeah, because just changing jurisdiction, it sounds like to me.
It is definitely.
Because there's some issues with old trees that you have to get rid of once in a while, and they're right. Ruining the sidewalks and ruining your house and stuff.
Right, those issues are still dealt with DPW.
They always were DPW.
And they will remain, yeah.
All right. Okay, this sounds reasonable to me.
Commissioner Richards.
Just quick question. Significant trees, nothing's really changing in terms of the program. So significant trees are still viewed as significant trees, and they get cared for with the same level of care in terms of just the decision-making process.
That's correct. Yeah.
I think this makes a lot of sense, and I move to approve.
Second.
It's approval with modifications.
With the modifications.
With modifications, yeah.
Very good. So I did hear the maker and the seconder acknowledge that. Thank you very much. Did we take public comment?
We did, but there wasn't any.
That was quick. Commissioners, on that motion to adopt a recommendation for approval with modifications, Commissioner Antonini?
Aye.
Commissioner Hillis?
Aye.
Commissioner Johnson?
Aye.
Commissioner Moore?
Aye.
Commissioner Richards?
Aye.
Commissioner Wu?
Aye.
And Commission President Fong?
Aye.
So moved, Commissioners. That motion passes unanimously 7-0. And places you on item 10 for case number 2014.1019C at 1000 Mississippi Street. This is a conditional use authorization.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Erica Jackson of Planning Department staff. Before you is a request for conditional use authorization for a planned unit development to allow the construction of 4 residential buildings containing a total of 28 dwelling units located on a 0.53 acre undeveloped site with street frontage on Mississippi Street and Texas Street. The project is asking for modifications for density, rear yard, and method of measurement for height. As you can see from the emails in your staff report, Planning Department staff has received many emails and phone calls from neighbors with concerns regarding the proposed project. The project was continued from the April 2nd Planning Commission calendar by the project sponsor in order to allow more time for revisions to the project in response to neighbor concerns. Since April 2nd, there have been a series of community meetings. The plans you have in your packet reflect several changes made by the project sponsor in response to neighbor concerns, such as the elimination of the second driveway garage access point along Mississippi Street, the removal of a stair penthouse, and a series of setbacks along the Mississippi Street frontage of Building A. Since the staff report was published, staff has received one letter of support and a modification to the letter from the Mississippi Street neighbors that includes more signatures of support. I can pass those out to you. As part of the proposal, the project sponsor proposes to extend Texas Street by approximately 270 feet. The extension of Texas Street would be approximately 35 feet wide, with a 10-foot wide sidewalks adjoining the project site. In addition to providing pedestrian and vehicular access to currently landlocked properties and additional on-street parking, the street extension will improve fire department access by creating a fire truck turnaround at the end of Texas Street. The department recommends approval of the project because it complies with the applicable PUD requirements of the planning code, is consistent with the objectives and policies of the general plan, and the project will develop a large underutilized property in an urban area with 28 family-sized housing units, including 3 affordable housing units. Given the findings discussed, staff recommends approval of the conditional use authorization for this plan unit development. This concludes my presentation. I'm available for questions.
Project sponsor, please.
Hi, good afternoon, Commissioners. Melinda Sarjapur, Ruben Junius, and Rose. I have here with me today Ryan and Jim Egan for the project sponsors, Heights Properties, and Ian Burchell, the project architect. We're excited to be here today after what's been a long process for this project. I'd like to start off with just a quick project history for context. This project was originally approved by the Commission in 2008 and received one performance extension since that time. Unfortunately, the original owner was not able to obtain a site permit, partially due to the recession and partially due to some unique site infrastructure circumstances. Heights Properties purchased the project in late 2012, and they continue to pursue a site permit. They were fortunately able to resolve what had been a water infrastructure challenge at the site recently by agreeing to run a new water main line from 25th Street all the way up to the new project site. However, by the time that issue was resolved, the performance period had expired, and it was no longer eligible for an administrative extension. So we filed this current application to reauthorize the project, and the sponsor is now ready to move forward with the development pending the Commission's approval. I do want to point out a couple of challenging aspects about this site. I'm going to put an image up on the monitor here from the Commission package. As you can see here, this is an irregularly shaped lot, and it has frontage on both Mississippi Street and a portion of Texas that is going to be extended as part of the project. Right now, the area on Texas is landlocked. Texas actually stops somewhere around 170 feet to the south of this site, so they will be extending that as part of the project. Also, while it's not easy to see from the aerial view, I'll place a site view from Mississippi Street here. This would be the project site. You can see that it has quite a significant slope coming up from Mississippi toward Texas. In terms of the project before you, it's largely consistent with what was approved in 2008. It has the same dwelling unit count, height, number of parking spaces. All of the units would have at least 2 bedrooms, so suitable for family use. 2 of the units would be 3-bedroom, 1 would be a 4-bedroom unit. Also, the sponsor here intends to provide on-site BMR units. Since 2008, there have been a few changes. The architect's going to go into those in detail in just a couple minutes, but in general, this project has decreased in size by about 7,300 square feet, increased building setbacks, added about 630 square feet of open space, which eliminated the previous need for exception, and is now subject to the Eastern Neighborhoods impact fees. As part of this PUD approval, the project is seeking 3 minor code exceptions. First, from a rear yard setback requirement, that's to allow interior courtyards instead of a traditional lot setback, which makes sense given that this site is a through lot. We'd like to have active frontage on both frontages. And also, the steeply sloping topography allows us to provide more usable open space in the center area. Second, modification from residential density to allow 5 additional units at the site. This isn't a large number. The 5 additional units will contribute to the city's housing stock. And finally, a slight modification from the method of measurement for height. This is allowed under Planning Code Section 304 as part of the PUD process. And it's necessary here because the standard methods that you see under Section 260 aren't always appropriate for larger, deeper, steeply sloping sites such as these. The modification is only going to affect a small portion of the northeasternmost building, and it's within the 40-foot height limit with the modification. Finally, I do want to touch base on recent changes that have been made to the project in response to neighbor outreach. We were originally scheduled for hearing on April 2nd. As that date approached, we received a number of comments from neighbors expressing concerns regarding design and the impacts of the project on Mississippi in terms of traffic and parking. Specifically, as the project was coming back for CU approval, the sponsors had added an additional garage entry on Mississippi that wasn't there originally. As part of that comment and response process, we learned that in 2008, the previous project owner had informed the neighbors that there would not be a garage access on Mississippi. When they became aware of that project history, they removed it from the design. The current project that's before you has vehicular access only from Texas Street. So that is something that has been addressed. Also, they've made a number of design changes specifically related to size and massing concerns. And access. They've removed an elevator near the Mississippi Street entrance to minimize access from that point. They've increased setbacks from Mississippi Street 5 to 7 feet in addition to the 10 feet already that had been there before. Removed a stair penthouse located near Mississippi Street. Shrunk some portions of buildings located closest to the nearest neighbor on Mississippi Street. Increased landscaping on Mississippi, and revised the project design's material palette so that it better complemented the neighborhood. So at this time, I'm going to ask Ian Burchell, the project architect, to come up and give an overview of the evolution of design and some information on that end.
Excuse me. President Fong, members of the Commission, my name is Ian Burchell, and we are the architect for this project. It's been a long road. We started work on this project in 2007. And I would like to start showing the slides. Thank you. Next slide, please. So this is the neighborhood context, showing you the topography, basic street front. The site here, excuse me, let's get this mouse rolling. Okay, the image that's in the upper right-hand corner is a photograph of the site with the newly added adjacent building that's been built since the project was first purchased. Next slide, please. This is the project back in, go back one, please. This is the project back in 2008, and you'll see that we have a lot more mass on the property than we have in the current design. Next slide, please. This slide, which is in your set, also shows the setbacks that been referred to that were been done in response to the neighborhood commission, neighborhood community group. And this has happened over the last 4 weeks. The slides, the images on the left-hand side show the before and after. So the lower slide is before we made these changes. The upper slide is before we made the changes, and the lower image is after the changes. So this has been done primarily to basically push.
Oh, excuse me. Sorry. You need to stay at the mic so people can hear you. So.
Sorry, I'm going to try to speak over that. Anyway, you can see that we try to push the corner back. Next slide, please. These are views of the adjacent property on the right-hand side, showing the new building behind it. You will see the stepping up that we've done to try to break the scale of the building on Mississippi to address the height of the adjacent building. Next slide, please. So this is the main entrance floor plan, and Something that I would like to point out to you, there are 28 units, 22 two-bedrooms, and there are 2 3s and 1 4-bedroom. The 2 3s and the 1 4-bedroom will be the below-market rate units on site. The entrance to the property is Texas. The project was first filed as a 1000 Mississippi address, which is why we have 1000 Mississippi still as a project descriptor, but it's a 1001 Texas address. That's where the project is entered, that's where the mail gets delivered, and that's where people arrive to the site. Next slide, please. This shows the entrance exit on Mississippi. This point of access and egress to the building is actually 3 floors below the first elevator stop. So we don't see this being actively used as an entrance. It is basically a required exit from the building. But to complete the streetscape, we've treated it as though it had building frontage in the design. Next, please. So we're going up through the hillside with a stepping staircase. Next slide. And this is the garage level. The garage is entered only now from Texas. There's no access from Mississippi. At the garage level, we have the bike storage and trash and the usual back-of-house facilities. Next level. So the first residential level here, the blue unit on the right-hand side is the 4-bedroom. It's a duplex unit. The 3-bedroom units are represented by the 2 purplish color on the left-hand side of the plan. May I be forgiven to move forward quickly?
Go ahead.
You have 25 seconds.
Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next.
And we'll ask you a question.
And you'll see that we have open areas in orange and yellow. These are rooftop terraces. Next slide, please. Next. Elevations to Texas. Elevations facing the food bank. Next. This is the elevation on Mississippi. Next. Keep going, please. These are some of the renderings showing the building, various angles.
Sir, unfortunately, your time is up, but I do believe the commissioners will have questions for you.
And
Thank you.
We have the benefit of the plans here in front of us, so.
Yes, I thank you.
Thank you.
I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Opening it up to public comment, if there's any. One speaker card, sorry. Brian Reed.
Hi, my name is Brian Reed. I live at 1085 directly across the street from the project that they've shown, and I organized the neighborhood in originally opposition to it, but with the changes and the negotiation that's taken place with the developer, if we can be assured that the address is 1001 Texas, that there will be no driveway. We had been assured of that in 2008, and it would changed. That is not an elevator access or mail delivery on Mississippi, and that the Mississippi address will not be used, and everything that they basically agreed to, we support the project, think it should be done. And I would hope you approve it and get it built as soon as possible. Questions?
I don't believe so. There may be questions for you. Thank you.
All right.
Is there any other public comment on this item? Okay, public comment is closed, and opening up to commissioners. Commissioner Antonini.
I remember this project when it came before us in 2008, and I think it is a better project now. Unfortunately, it's quite a few years, 7 years later, which speaks to one of the problems we didn't talk about during our housing things, the amount of time it takes to get something built. This had other factors, economic factors, that was not so much legal or procedural delays. But in any case, for all the reasons it's been given, it's well articulated. It's diminished the amount of exceptions it's asking for, all of which are fairly rudimentary, all 2-bedroom or more, so there is a chance that families could live there. And the other modifications they've made that have been mentioned that have gained the support of the neighborhood. So I think this is the kind of thing we want to support. I'm very supportive. I would move to approve.
Second.
Commissioners, there's a motion and a second to approve this matter with conditions on that motion. Commissioner.
Hang on 1 second, Janice. Commissioner Wu.
I am supportive of the project, but I wanted to say something on the record, which is that this project is very close to the Potrero Hill public housing project. And I had written the attorneys this morning that I want the owners, the eventual owners, to know that that plan has been in development for a very long time, and I don't want to hear that they don't want that plan to go forward.
Commissioner Moore.
For the record, while this project is a very sprung form in a very wide open area, there is a solution with small corridors along bedroom windows, which I normally call out. Mr. Burkle, you know my position on that. In this particular case, because the building form is very sprung and open to the outside, I will not object to it, otherwise I would.
If there's nothing further, Commissioners, there is a motion and a second to approve this matter with conditions. On that motion, Commissioner Antonini.
Aye.
Commissioner Hillis.
Aye.
Commissioner Johnson.
Aye.
Commissioner Moore.
Aye.
Commissioner Richards.
Aye.
Commissioner Wu.
Aye.
And Commission President Fong.
Aye.
So moved, Commissioners. That motion passes unanimously 7-0 and places you on item 11 for case number 2004.0093C. San Francisco Overlook, also known as 599 Crestmont Drive. This is a conditional use authorization.
Good afternoon, President Fong, members of the Commission, Michael Smith, Planning Department staff. The project before you seeks conditional use authorization to amend motion number 18820 to modify a previously authorized planned unit development on 2 vacant lots measuring approximately 63,890 square feet in size for the construction of 29 dwelling units and approximately 62,000 square feet of residential space, with 58 off-street parking spaces and a new paved approximately 20-foot wide by 700-foot long private street. The previous Planning Commission action in March of 2013 approved a PUD for a slightly larger project at that time that included 34 dwelling units and approximately 65,000 square feet of residential space and 68 off-street parking spaces. A total of 13 buildings would be constructed on the site, which is the same as was previously approved. The unit mix in the new project would be 5 single-family dwellings, which is an increase of 5 compared to the original project. There would be 14 duplex units, which is a decrease of 10. And 10 would be multi-family units contained in one building at the end, which is no change. The unit type would consist of 28 3-bedroom units, which is a decrease of 2, and 1 4-bedroom unit, which is an increase of 1. No 2-bedroom units are currently proposed in the project, which is a decrease of 4 from the original project. The modified project, as I said, would provide 58 off-street parking spaces, which is a decrease of 10 spaces. The proposed buildings would measure between approximately 16 to 40 feet in height above the new street grade that is proposed, and the entire development would be accessed from the private street at the end of Crestmont Drive. The project, as proposed, is substantially similar to the project unanimously approved by the Planning Commission in 2013, save for the deletion of 5 units, 10 parking spaces, and a reduction in height of 4 of the buildings. The modifications came through a negotiated settlement between the project sponsor and the Mount Sutro Woods Owners Association, of which the project property is a member, as a way of addressing neighborhood concerns over density, traffic, and views. And this all transpired after the Commission approvals in 2013. The department has not received any correspondence in opposition from the public regarding the current proposal before you. And before we move forward, there's a few things I want to, additional CEQA finding that I want to read into the record that I need to have, should you approve the project, have that included. So the reason being is that this project, the EIR was certified back in 2013, and so now we're here a number of years later. So this commission finds that the approval contemplated in this motion is within the scope of the project analyzed in the final EIR. Since the certification of the final EIR, no changes have occurred with respect to the project or the circumstances surrounding the project, and no new information has been put forward that would result in new significant environmental impacts not adequately analyzed in the final EIR, cause a substantial increase in impacts previously identified in the final EIR, or require additional review under CEQA. And once again, there is a note to file that says that this project is covered by the previous EIR, by the ERO. This concludes my presentation. I'm available for any questions or comments, and the project sponsor is here as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Project sponsor, please.
Commissioners, staff, my name is Gary Testa. I'm the project sponsor of San Francisco Overlook. 2 years ago, we presented our project to you, and you approved unanimously, and we appreciated that. After that time, we attempted to work together with the HOA to find a mutual solution to their concerns about height and density. After 2 years of work, I'm happy to say that we were able to find a fully signed, mutually negotiated settlement that resulted in the changes that planning has just reviewed. That's effectively a reduction of 5 units and a corresponding reduction in the number of parking units. Personally, I'm very pleased with the result. We were able to come to a mutual agreement. I believe that the HOA at this point and myself are able to move forward quickly on that. I'd like to have my project planner quickly review the changes with you. Thank you very much for your time.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Adam Phillips, Project Manager for the San Francisco Overlook Project. As Gary and Michael both mentioned, this project in many ways has not changed much since the project we presented 2 years ago. However, since a little time has passed and we do have some new commissioners, I wanted to run over quickly the overview of what we're proposing here for the benefit of everyone. Up on the screen here is an overview map showing where the location of San Francisco Overlook is. It's on the northwest slope of Mount Sutro in the Forest Knolls neighborhood within an RM1 40X height bulk district. The proposed project, we believe, is very appropriate and consistent with the RM1 zoning and the neighbors that are nearby us. The existing 1.14 acre site is an undeveloped infill site that will be accessed by the end of Crestmont Drive. Here's a site plan of the project, and I just wanted to sort of go over what's changed in the layout of the units. As Michael had mentioned, we have 13 buildings, 5 of which have changed from the last time around. They're marked by I guess it's showing up as brown circles on the 5 units there. The change that was made on those and changing them from what was originally a duplex unit of two-story units, because we reduced those 5 buildings by 1 story, changing them from a 2-unit duplex into a single-family home, 3 stories in height, effectively reducing the height by 1 story. And this was done as part of the negotiation with our neighbors to help maintain views across the tops of the buildings. Other than that, the project is identical to what was proposed. The buildings in the middle stretch there are each individual duplexes. They're 4-story buildings, generally 2 above street grade and 2 below street grade. And the buildings at the end is actually a 10-unit multifamily building, each with individual townhomes with parking garage underneath. I wanted to talk briefly about parking here because our situation was a little unusual. Where we are accessed only off the end of an existing cul-de-sac in an area which is very poorly served by public transit. We were lobbied very hard from the neighborhood to provide in excess of the 1.5 units per 1.5 parking spaces per unit, and we approved a ratio of 2-to-1 in the last authorization. We are merely scaling down that same 2-to-1 ratio for this proposal, but asking to maintain that. In the interest of encouraging less reliance on individual car ownership, however, we are going to be providing at least 1 car share space and a dedicated space for bicycle parking. Here are the proposed building elevations, and I just wanted to highlight the sort of good urban design principles that are being worked together. It's designed to both complement, it's both in built and natural contexts. Many of the buildings are separated through creating view corridors through the site and scaled appropriate to the other development in the vicinity. The proposed design puts a premium on blending with the hillside, not flashy or contrasting, instead seeking to complement the harmony of the surrounding natural environment. The streetscape is another kind of great amenity of the project. Sort of keying off the Better Streets program, we're proposing no parking on the street and as you can see, a colored concrete sidewalk with a great bunch of trees. We're sort of thinking this is sort of a pedestrian thoroughfare that goes to our fire truck turnaround at the end of the site. We're proposing some amenities such as benches, landscaping, and a basketball hoop down there. So we're creating something of a parklet type of amenity there. The street, while it is a private street, will not be gated and therefore will be open for everyone in the neighborhood to use. I wanted to briefly just show the project sections, just to touch on the fact we are on a steep hillside site. Obviously, hillside stability is one of the major points of focus for this project. And one of the things that we're happy to say is we're reducing cut and fill on the site. And according to our geotechnical report as part of our EIR, the poured pier foundations we're doing will actually result in greater hillside stability than the hill is currently. Finally, last but certainly not least, is sustainable design, which is one of the core principles of the design of this project. We definitely have strongly embraced environmental stewardship through efficient design and choice of sustainable materials. Among some of the features of the building include effective white site water management, low water native planting, vegetated green roofs on many of the buildings, radiant floor heating, acid frost ventilation, natural daylighting, energy-efficient fixtures and appliances, and environmentally preferable flooring and FSC certified wood. That concludes the highlights of the design. I'm available for questions if anyone has any. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, opening up to public comment. Seeing no public comment's closed. Commissioner Moore.
I'm glad to see the project coming back. It was a skillfully designed project. It remains a skillfully designed project. It was difficult to discuss way back when because there was so much opposition. However, I think the quality of the design and the response by building block to many of the challenges which the site itself presents were resolved in such a convincing manner that this is really only the dot of an I where the changes don't really affect what we approved other than the numerical reduction. We have the same values. I am glad that you did not abandon the property and sold the entitlements, which unfortunately we often witness without having any recall of preserving what we approved. In this particular case, I hope that you'll start construction tomorrow, and you have my full support.
Commissioner Hillis.
Just a question. There was discussion when we last heard this about getting down the hill and accessing kind of down to Fifth Street. I think there may be, at the time, there wasn't that proposal. And I don't know if that Kirkham proposal is right beneath you or not.
We have had an initial conversation with them and look forward to speaking with them further. Their proposal is in early stage and is currently undergoing development, but we have reached out to them and they've reached out to us, and we expect to be talking to them further.
So do you think this would allow, like through that, I mean, would it allow access? Because it's a circuitous way to get out there, right, to Crestmont. And
correct.
There's a way to encourage people to take transit by that kind of quick, I mean, it would obviously be steep, but going down the hill
absolutely
to Fifth and the Inner Sunset.
Well, if you'll recall from last time, we had spent a great deal of time and effort, unfortunately fruitless at the time, to negotiate that through access way with them. So we're hopeful now that they have their own project pending that we'll be able to negotiate that. But I know they are proposing very substantial changes even to the way that Fifth Avenue is being routed through that area. So we've been sort of waiting till the plans settle down a bit so we can be able to see what would be the most optimal way that we might be able to work with them to provide the access path.
And where could it possibly be? I mean, along that sewer easement?
Yeah, well, we have... If you'll see on there, we have an easement which currently connects to, you can see the very top of that drawing, there's a sort of bulb of where Fifth Avenue is.
Right.
In order to access some of the lower portions of the adjoining units on either side of, you can see that little gray stripe.
Yeah.
It's about a third of the way. That would be the location that we would, in theory, be able to make that connection point, because we do have, I think it's about a 20-foot wide width between those two buildings.
Right.
So there's no physical constraints that would allow us to do it. It's merely been a case of being able to secure the permissions to be able to cross the adjoining property and then access the public right-of-way, which, again, is somewhat in flux, as I understand it, from their current design plans.
But I mean, they're obviously going to come to us for approval, so we can work with them too.
Well, that would be much appreciated.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Commissioner Antoni.
Yeah, I just had a question for staff or for project sponsor. Will this be a continuation of Crestmont Drive, or will this be given another name as a separate street, or do we know that answer yet?
Just because I'm not sure that.
My understanding is that this is a private driveway, though it's not fenced off from Crestmont Drive, so the public can walk down there if they choose to. But it's my understanding that it'll be a private driveway that is maintained by that homeowners association.
Right, that part I get, but they will have to give it, there will have to be addresses, so I'm questioning whether the addresses would be Crestmont or whether they would be a newly named street.
I'm not sure if that's been worked out yet.
Okay. The reason I bring that up, I think the early plan we read about from back in the 60s, there was a plan for Crestmont to continue in another direction and go even further, and some of that was never built. So one would assume that since that's already kind of been mapped for a continuation that never occurred, the city might give you another street name, but
Yeah, we're open to a new street name. The street itself will be maintained by the HOA of the project itself. Right. And as you are correct, Crestmont originally continued up at a 90-degree angle from where our street was coming in and was to wrap around the hillside. So yes. I would imagine a different street name would be appropriate.
Yeah, thank you. And the other thing I just wanted to mention is this is really encouraging to see some single-family homes being built, and even though there only are five of those, I guess, in the project now, essentially you're building 29, because you've got townhouses, you've that duplexes, which are just like two singles joined together, and this will be what we need more of in San Francisco, because for people trying to buy homes, there's a huge demand for new homes, because what you get is new and it's in good shape and it's ready to go, and unlike many of the older homes, which not only have to pay to buy them, but you have to pay a lot to get them usable after they've been fixed up. So this is very welcome, and I hope it's the beginning of utilizing some of these areas on the west side that can be appropriate for housing, and to put more housing units over there to start to meet the demands that we've heard about that exist in San Francisco.
Commissioner Johnson.
Thank you very much. Yeah, great project. Just real quick question. I think one car sharing space across 58 spaces is not a very good ratio. What's the opportunity to add more car sharing spaces?
Currently, we have 29 units, so we believe that the demand is not greater than one. We do have additional parking spaces. However, with the 2-to-1 approval that we have not requested an increase in the number of spaces. So we've tried to maintain the number of private spaces to what's available for a car share.
Right, I disagree. I don't think that you need 2-to-1 for each one of those units.
My only comment there would be that given really the location of where we are and the lack of transit in that particular location, it makes it very difficult to access the site otherwise.
Right, and that's why I think we need more car sharing than less, so that people can use those cars as a way to get around, and that becomes an amenity for people to be able to get back and forth. So, anyways, I'll hear other commissioners, but I have a suggestion maybe for that.
please.
Steve Vettel, a land use attorney for the project sponsor. Just one point to make is that you can offer car share parking spaces, but you have to interest a car share company in using those spaces. And for 29 units, it's going to be even a challenge to get a car share company interested in one space. So I think we're committed to one. If there's demand for more than one, we can certainly accommodate them more. But it seems unlikely with 29 spaces you're going to have a demand for more than one car share space that a car share company would be interested in using.
Okay.
Thanks.
Pardon me, before we beat this to death. However, the infrastructure that we provided in the parking garage is actually the same physical space for when we were providing more cars. So if such a interest and demand were to be manifest, we would have the physical space to consider accommodating.
Right. And I think that was kind of what I was trying to get at. Like, what's the opportunity there? You know, sort of how are you running the space? Okay, thank you.
Commissioner, we have lots of space. The parking space opportunity is going to be very, with the reduction, is actually an additional, almost an additional 7 spaces, I believe, under the podium. So we have the space.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Commissioner Antonini.
Yeah, I'm going to move to approve this project. I think it's very well done.
Second.
I'll second it, and I was out there on kind of a gushy, wet day. So happy to see that you've worked out some different scenarios with the neighbors and the landscape and the terrain. So congratulations, or pre-congratulations.
If it's amenable to the maker of the motion and the seconder to adopt this, or to approve with conditions as amended with the findings read into the record by staff.
Agree.
Yes, thank you. It is amenable to me.
To me.
Thank you. Then on that motion, Commissioners, to approve this matter with conditions as amended with the finding read into the record by staff, Commissioner Antonini.
Aye.
Commissioner Hillis.
Aye.
Commissioner Johnson.
Aye.
Commissioner Moore.
Aye.
Commissioner Richards.
Aye.
Commissioner Wu.
Aye.
And Commission President Fong.
Aye.
So moved, Commissioners. That motion passes unanimously 7-0 and places you under your discretionary review calendar for item 12. Case number 2014.1077D at 1948 Ocean Avenue. This is a mandatory discretionary review.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Marcel Boudreau with Department staff. You have before you a request for mandatory discretionary review to remove a condition placed by previous discretionary review action. The project sponsor of 1948 Ocean Avenue, doing business as Legend Billiards Hall, has been operating under an other entertainment use. An initial building permit was filed in May 2011 for an other entertainment use and for a bar use. In 2011, during the Section 312 public notice period, 2 public discretionary reviews were filed. Following the discretionary review hearing on January 12, 2012, conditions were placed on the operations of Legend Billiards Hall, including a restriction disallowing alcohol sales. Legend Billiards Hall has been operating since 2012. During an initial 6-month review period, which ended June 6, 2013, the establishment has been code compliant. The current request seeks to remove the restriction on alcohol sales, which will allow the owners to seek an ABC Type 40 license for sale of beer for on-site consumption only. Minors will be allowed on the premises. The business would not be required to operate as a bona fide eating place, however, snacks or sandwiches must be available. This type of license would be considered a bar use under the planning code. The current operating hours are from Sunday through Thursday, 2 p.m. to 2 a.m., and Friday to Saturday, 1 p.m. to 2 a.m. The project sponsor has provided support letters in your packets from the Ocean Avenue Association and one signed support letter from the director of the OMI Cultural Participation Project. This project sponsor has provided 5 signed form letters from small businesses on the subject block in support of the proposal. The department has received 1 phone call and objection to the addition of the bar use. The department has received 1 email and objection to the bar use. Since the packet was published, that same neighbor has submitted another objection letter. And the Ingleside Terraces Homes Association has submitted a letter in support of removing the condition restricting alcohol sales. This group was also one of the previous DR filers during the original Section 312. The department recommends the Commission take discretionary review to remove condition number 5 from previous discretionary review action in 2012, which currently disallows the alcohol sales at subject establishment. Additionally, the department is making a request for another 6-month review to the Planning Commission. All other conditions from previous discretionary review action 0250 would remain in effect. This does conclude my presentation. I'm available for further questions. Thanks.
Project sponsor, please.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Marcia Garland. I'm here to introduce the three partners of Legend, Billiard Hall, Johnston Yao, Winchell Yu, and Kim Tang. Johnston Yao is American-born, and Winchell and Kim are immigrants. They have worked full-time at other jobs in order to keep this business going. Johnston works at SF General Hospital in the eligibility department. Winchell works in patient financial services at the Chinese hospital, and Kim works 2 restaurant jobs. These are not high-paying jobs, and Legend Billiard Hall is not a hobby business. It is a step towards their dream of owning their own business and having a better future. They have spent almost 2 years of going through red tape to come before you today. It's taken 22 months to get here. They have done adequate outreach, and the opposition is stating that beer, like Professor Harold Hill in The Music Man states in mockery, that beer is leading on the road to the depths of degradation. This is an overreaction, an alarmist point of view, especially given the system of checks and balances in place. They are accountable to the police department, the planning department, various neighborhood associations, the ABC, and the Entertainment Commission, plus to each other. They have worked hard to establish this business. They don't want to screw things up now. If these young men make a mistake, they will be found out, and I urge you to give them a chance. I now turn this over to Johnston Yao.
Hello, Commissioners. My name is Johnston Yao, one of the owners of Legend Billiards. We've come a long way. 22 months. 22 months to be exact, to finally be able to stand here in front of you and hope to be able to move forward with our attempt to amend our conditional use permit so that we may apply for a Type 40 beer license. All three of us, Winchell Yu, Kim Tang, and myself, have worked extremely hard at other jobs just to keep up with the overhead expenditures associated with the business. This is our first business, and prior to the start, we were new to the area, and were told to first get the business running before addressing other components. On the other hand, while very few billiards businesses offer snooker like us, we thought it would attract a significant amount of people familiar with the type of game. We were wrong, though, and have since been paying a high price while going through the process of adjusting our business model. The three of us are hard-working individuals who come from families that once struggled to survive in America. Our parents have proven to us that hard work really does pay off, and this is why we are continuing to work hard and refusing to give up on our business that we've built from the bottom up. Therefore, we ask for your support today so that we don't have to close the doors and walk away from our dream. Thank you, Commissioners.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Stefano Costellato, and I'm a consultant working on this project. Could you put the fixed bus? Okay. Well, basically, the venue itself has a capacity of 49 people. It's a ground floor use that has 8 tables and a mezzanine level that has 2 tables. So what we did was we realized that there's no way that this venue in its form could morph into anything other than a billiards hall that serves beer. And also what they've done is they put in surveillance cameras in the exterior and the interior. They've gone through leads training, ABC leads training, so that they can serve education, like by not overpouring beer or anything like that nature. They also have professional security, which they'll engage with and have individually their own guard cards. Okay? They're taking a lot of steps so that they can provide safeguards and give the neighbors assurances that they're going to be responsible and manage the place well. They happen to be on the 1900 block corridor, which needs some stabilization. This business will stabilize itself. It will stabilize the corridor. In a Ocean Avenue corridor that wants more pedestrian traffic. So they're going to be consistent. Commissioners, they're part of the solution on Ocean Avenue, not part of the problem.
Okay, opening it up for public comment, if there is any.
Hi, Commissioners. My name is Blake Key. I would love to read this letter from the Ingleside Terraces Home Association from Mark Gardino, who's the president of the association. On behalf of the Ingleside Terraces Home Association, I'm writing to express our position regarding the removal of a restriction prohibiting alcohol sales at 1948 Ocean Avenue, Legend Billiards. This restriction was requested in part by us at their initial discretionary review in 2012, prior to their opening of business. Since that time, the owners have demonstrated consideration, responsibility to the needs of the neighborhood. We have also received clean periodic reports from Tyrrell Station, representatives of San Francisco Police Department to our monthly meetings. The owners have attended a number of our monthly meetings, and in January this year made presentation that they will have installed a full complement of security cameras to monitor the drinking. They also assure us that they would have successfully completed the California State License Education Lead Training Program. Finally, they have assured us that billiards will remain the focus of the business and minors will continue to be welcomed. In this, therefore, our position that the current restriction prohibiting alcohol sales be removed to this extent necessary to allow the obtaining of a Type 40 license beer only as requested by owners while maintaining and remaining condition imposed by the Planning Commission in their discretionary review. I own a adjacent business across the street from Legend Billiards, and I was here before you in November. We spend time here, and we spent time at the Board of Appeals, and it's a long process, and I give it to these guys that spend so much time and trying to make the business work, and please give them a chance, and they will help us have some type of synergy in the corridor. That block needs a lot of help, and these businesses kind of stabilize it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Dan Weaver, the Executive Director of the Ocean Avenue Association, which is a San Francisco CBD. I'm here also to endorse this project. The Legend Billiards owners have accepted a whole series of requirements and limits, and that they've done the right thing. They haven't done anything wrong. These limits were supposed to be on for 2 years. Now it's more than 2 years. It points out to us, on Ocean Avenue, the planning department knows us as a mix of chain businesses and small individually owned businesses or family owned. The chains are going to win because it's so simple and so easy and so mechanized, and the banks open their doors. With small businesses, it's an extraordinary challenge. As we've seen with these two businesses, we'd like to keep a balance. That's why we try to especially support small businesses that want to start, and I would recommend that you do that also. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Ronald Shea. I am a resident in the area, and I have gone to City College for the last 10 years. I've been to Legends Billiards a couple times. A couple times actually I've gone into the store. It was kind of an unusual aspect of having only a couple people on tables while there was no real other activity going on. I've been a patron of Family Billiards on Geary Street for almost at least the last decade. You know, I've been going there since I was in high school. You know, they've served alcohol there the whole time I've been there. You know, very little trouble. You know, almost everything seems to be running well. You know, I mean, 90% of the tables are maxed out all day long. Okay, it keeps business running all the time. There's people coming by regularly, and they have a really great communal relationship with the local PD. You know, I've seen local PD come through a lot where they've actually just checked on them and made sure everything's working fine. It seems to work out really well. Ocean Avenue seems to lack a lot of this like nightlife. You know, after 10 o'clock, it seems to really go downhill, very dead. There's almost no one on the streets themselves, almost to the point where it's actually scary. You know, bringing in some type of nightlife will actually bring in a lot more customer base, a lot more patrons to the area, therefore bring in a lot more visible people, a lot more ability to track the crime that might be going on, anything that might actually happen in the area. You know, as of right now, it just seems to be very empty. So without some type of night entertainment, such as, you know, more of the bars, like say the Ave Bar that's actually down the street, you know, they're going to be closing down soon with a whole bunch of different changes to their buildings. You know, that loses one more bar, therefore there's even less entertainment on Ocean Avenue. So we actually really require this type of entertainment to get the synergy going with the whole community, you know, to get this area to have some type of stay aspect versus a communal aspect where most people are just coming through, grabbing something and leaving. Thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Hi, Commissioners. Good afternoon. My name is Mike Yip. I'm also a resident near the project on Ocean. I do want to just bring up a couple of things like Ocean Avenue doesn't have many destination points. People go there either to go to school or they go there to get into 19th Avenue or they go there just to go by. Now, being a billiards hall, it should have been like entertainment and destination point for Ocean Avenue for people that love pool. Like I am an avid player of, you know, pool hall, and family billiards is a place that I frequent very frequently with my friends. But with Legends being there for the past 2 years, I've only been there a couple times because most of my friends that play pool likes to drink beer. Beer in a billiards hall, it's like popcorn in a movie theater, you know? It's like, it's something that goes hand in hand. It's not asking you to sell, whiskey or vodka. It's something, it's beer. And it's in a mood where people actually just want to enjoy it. So watching a game, playing pool, you know, having fun with your friends. And that's something that I think Ocean Avenue desperately needs. They need entertainment spots where people feel like they want to be there. My friends don't want to go with me to Legends because they don't have beer. Like, how am I going to shoot pool with no beer? I don't understand. And I understand that. It's like, we go watch a movie, I want popcorn. But they don't serve popcorn. You can only have a glass of water. It don't even make sense. So, and these guys, I've worked with them because we're also like, I've been there, I talked to them through like, you know, different meetings and on Ocean Avenue, and I've met these guys, I've spoken to them, and, you know, 3 guys working full-time jobs and also having to run a business just to cover overhead is, you know, it's not why people want to start businesses in San Francisco. It's not, no one starts a business thinking, you know, I'm going to start this business so I can work somewhere else full-time just to make this business run. It's supposed to run itself. It's not doing that, let alone like feeding them. And so I feel like, especially coming from immigrant, you know, families, we're just all trying to get American dream, you know. But the dream is not to open a business and work at a different place either, right? So, yeah, please let this, like, you know, this thing, let them get their the beer license. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other additional public comment? Okay, public comment is closed. Commissioner Richards.
Interestingly enough, Tuesday night I was playing pool in the Moby Dick bar in the Castro, and I was drinking beer. So I get the relationship. I guess the question for staff would be, if we approve this, we could restrict it to just a Type 40 license, just beer.
That's Delvin Washington, Southwest Team Leader. That's correct, Commissioner. This is a Type 40 beer only. You are allowed to sell on premises, and minors are allowed to enter with a Type 40 license.
Okay. The second question is, what's the definition of beer? And the reason why I ask is there are some beers I drink that contain 12% alcohol, and they're almost like, they're pretty up there on the alcohol level. Is there a definition, an upper end of what alcohol content can be in beer?
I think that varies from state to state, and I'm not sure what the actual maximum alcohol content is for beer.
Okay. Any idea? I'll leave it up to the ABC. Mm-hmm. It's a local small-end business. You know, these guys came before this commission before. I think there was neighborhood opposition. It seems like there's not a lot going on there in terms of bad things happening, and the neighbors seem to be pulling together to make this happen. It needs to be a destination place. There's some downsides. It's next to an MCD, but it's an MCD I think I saw when I went out there to visit Blake with his proposed business. It doesn't seem to be open very often. It's kind of a block that needs to find itself. I don't know if you want to call it dead, but I think serving beer here would probably be a great idea to keep the business going, and I'll see what my other fellow commissioners say.
Commissioner Antonini.
I remember the approval process from, I guess it was 3 years ago, and I don't remember there being any mention of a time frame on the restriction on alcohol. I think we just passed it with no alcohol being allowed in response to neighborhood concerns. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I can't remember all the details.
You're correct. There was the time frame was related to the 6-month review. There was the condition related to alcohol sales, and that did not have a time frame associated with it.
Yeah, it was just a review. That's the first thing. The other thing that concerns me, I think this in and of itself is not a problem, but and this is not before us today, but there is an MCD very close by, and then there's the Voice of the Pentecost School. So I'm not quite sure how all those things ended up getting approved together, because I thought there was a 500-foot radius around schools that, maybe it's not a public school, I guess, because it's private, but I just out of curiosity, because a lot of the discussion when we went through it the first time centered on the fact that it was so close to an MCD, because one of the things we're not supposed to do is to put MCDs really close to where there's, alcohol serving facilities, and, sort of the reverse here, but just curious about how this all came to be.
It's because it's not a public school, Commissioner. I believe the restriction is within a certain distance of a public school.
Yeah, I wasn't aware that was actually the code, but that I don't really know why it makes a difference whether it's public or private, because it's still young people there. But that doesn't concern the pool hall, the billiards hall.
Commissioner Moore.
I'm prepared to support this application on the condition that there is a periodic reporting back to us. We supported this as a small business with a particular emphasis on small business, young people who are trying to kind of make it. And while at that time I think there was a strong statement by the applicants that they felt they could do without alcohol, that seemed to have changed a little bit. I'm prepared, given the limited scope of the application, to approve it with the condition that it comes back for periodic reporting to us.
Second. That's a motion.
That's a motion, yeah.
Commissioner Moore, periodically in the past,
6 months.
6 months.
Yes.
Thank you. Very good.
And it can just be a staff report and update. We haven't heard anything. Things are going well. They're adding the type of foot traffic we want and all of those good things.
And just for the clarity, once in the next 6 months, because you said periodic updates, plurally, and so is.
I would like to see a full year of them kind of going through the cycle of reporting. It would be twice.
2 updates.
Yeah, please.
Every 6 months.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you.
I'm okay with the second on that.
Thank you.
Just a quick question to staff. Do you know if there's been any police problem or crime problem in the since 2012?
There have not been any reports of any issues from the Terrebonne station.
Yeah, I didn't think so. Okay. Thank you.
Commissioners, then there is a motion and a second in front of you to take DR and approve this project with conditions as amended to include 2 updates over the next year every 6 months. On that motion, Commissioner Antonini.
Aye.
Commissioner Hillis.
Aye.
Commissioner Johnson.
Aye.
Commissioner Moore.
Aye.
Commissioner Richards.
Aye.
Commissioner Wu.
Aye.
And Commission President Fong.
Aye.
So moved, Commissioners. That motion passes unanimously 7-0 and places you on item 13 for case number 2013.1775, DRM at 470 Edinburgh Street. This is also a mandatory discretionary review.
Commissioners, I wanted to introduce you to another planner you have not met yet. Nancy Tran is the current planner with the Southwest Quadrant under Delvin's leadership. Before coming to work for San Francisco, she served as a senior planner for the city of Worcester in Massachusetts. During her time in Worcester, she helped staff 5 different commissions: the Planning, Zoning, Historical, Conservation, and License Commission, so she has a lot of commission experience. She received her master's in urban planning from UCLA and her bachelor's from UC Davis. We welcome.
Welcome.
Good afternoon, Commissioners, Mike Tran, Planning Department staff.
The item before you is a mandatory discretionary review for 470 Edinburgh Street, case number 2013.1775 DRM.
Could you pull the mic down a little bit? It's a little bit hard to hear. Thank you.
The project proposes to demolish an existing one-story over garage single-family dwelling that has been vacant since being fire damaged in 2002. It proposes to construct a two-story over garage single-family dwelling with habitable space on the ground floor. The existing building footprint is approximately 1,000 square feet, providing for one bedroom. The proposed construction will be approximately 1,400 square feet with 5 bedrooms. The subject property is zoned RH1 within the Excelsior neighborhood and located in an area with varying architectural styles, heights, and setbacks. The project was previously handled by another planner, Thomas Wayne, who has since retired. Section 311 neighborhood notification was completed in 2014 with no public concerns or outside DR. It has been reviewed by RDT, meets its guidelines, and complies with planning code. To date, the department has received no public comment from neighbors or neighborhood groups for the current proposal. The department recommends not taking DR, approving the demolition and construction as proposed. This concludes my presentation. I'm available for questions.
Thank you. DR requester. Oh, I'm sorry, this is mandatory.
Project sponsor, yeah.
Project sponsor, please, sorry.
Hi, my name is Marilyn Harvey, and this is my husband, Kevin Harvey, and I'm one of the owner of the property in 470 Edinburgh that got caught burned in 2002, and that's where I used to live, and also my parents was living there when the house caught on fire. Luckily, they're okay. So now I'm applying for rebuilding this property because it's been like a nuisance for 13 years, and every time I swing by there, my neighbor keep on asking me, when are you going to rebuild this house? Because, you know, they're looking at the burnt house for that long, since 2002. And when I first approached them for rebuilding the house, I had a little problem with both my neighbors because they didn't want my design. They said that they filed the DR on me, and that's when I decided that all the application I had, because what they don't want me to extend in the back, and they don't want me to block the view in front. So they said, why don't you just build up, and instead of going all the way to the back? Because I was thinking about building it right next to the property's back. What do you call this, deck? And then I keep on reseeding it several times. I have to change the plan, and then after that, I got sick, so I forgot. I didn't pay attention to about this property. So, and then in 2012, I applied for a demolition permit and have it redesigned and accommodated all what they wanted. And I even put like a 3-foot setback on the right-hand side of the property, because he's the one that told me that if you extend it all the way in front, I will complain. So I said, okay, I'll just give a 3-foot clearance. That way it's all the way. There won't be any views being blocked on his side. That's all I can say right now.
Okay, thank you. We might have questions for you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Opening up to public comment. Not seeing any. Public comments closed. Commissioner Moore.
I think it's a good replacement building. I'm glad that the issues of the neighborhood could be resolved. The only question I have for Mr. Washington is that in 3-story construction, we do not need an external fire escape anymore. This construction is typically sprinkled by now, which means that the rear yard and the rear elevation would actually be better by not having the fire escape, which the department or DBI will ultimately flag anyway. I just want to say that because I think the building can be simpler. Even affordable housing of this size has sprinkled buildings when there are 3 stories, so I would just like to put that to record and inform the consulting engineer that that is not required.
My mom wants an exit in the back because she already had that experience. If she's going to live in the house, she wants to make sure that she has an exit in front and in the back.
Mr. Washington, I think it is the DBI Fire Department provision that is not as much a choice by design, right?
I can confirm that with them, but yes. At this point, again, I'm not certain of the fire code, but again, we will check in with their department.
Thank you. A move to approve.
Second.
Commissioner Anthony.
Actually, the motion is not to take DR and approve the
Yeah.
project as proposed.
That's correct.
That is the
Thank you,
motion.
Commissioner
With the provision that you will instruct them on the requirements for the stair.
Commissioners, there is a motion and a second to not take DR and approve this project with direction from Commissioner Moore. On that motion, Commissioner Antonini.
Aye.
Commissioner Hillis.
Aye.
Commissioner Johnson.
Aye.
Commissioner Moore.
Aye.
Commissioner Richards. Aye. Commissioner Wu.
Aye.
And Commission President Fong.
Aye.
So moved, Commissioners. That motion passes unanimously 7-0 and places you under public comment, for which I have no speaker cards.
Is there any general public comment this evening, afternoon? Okay, not seeing any. The meeting is adjourned. Public comment is closed. Meeting is adjourned.